this important piece of legislation, and I look forward to the rest of the debate and hopefully the successful conclusion of the remaining stages.
Independent investigation of deaths.
Well, the question is that new clause 1 be read a second time. Mr. Philip Davies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful. And can I start by commending the honourable member for Croydon North, who is an excellent member of this House, Mr. Speaker. We clearly don't agree on lots of things, but he really is an excellent member of this House. He's doing two things in the course of this bill, which I should commend him for. The first is that he's bringing forward legislation which is of a particular interest to him, but also because of what happened in his constituency to a constituent of his. And I think he should be commended for doing that, and it goes to show the kind of local MP that he is. And it's absolutely right that the tragic case of Ola Shaney Lewis has prompted him to bring forward this legislation, which the thrust of which I absolutely support, as he well knows. But the second thing is, Mr. Speaker, is that unlike many people who bring forward private members' bills, he's engaged in a rather constructive manner with everybody who's brought forward amendments. I wish it were always like that, as we know it often isn't, but he certainly has. And I absolutely commend him for that. And I think the way that he's conducted himself throughout the course of the bill does him an enormous amount of credit, and I'm certainly grateful to him for doing that. Now, having said that, Mr. Speaker, obviously there are, as he alluded to in his speech, areas where we disagree about this bill. I absolutely support what he's trying to achieve, the thrust of what he's trying to achieve, and I think that very great many parts of the bill will make a considerable difference. But as with most pieces of legislation, to think that it can't be improved, I think, would be naive, and I think it can be improved. And in relation to the point of order I raised earlier, Mr. Speaker, I fear we are in danger of passing a piece of legislation that everybody in this House knows is not as good as it should be, and not as good as it could be, largely because of the paralysis of decision-making within the government. That means that they don't seem to be able to assess and agree amendments with the speed with which the honourable gentleman for Croydon North appears to have been able to look at these amendments and decide whether or not they should be agreed. And partly because I suspect that the civil service appear to have taken the government hostage in the running of public policy. I suspect the Department of Health is one of the worst. I will give way.
Thanks for giving way. I know that he is perhaps one of the most passionate in his defence and championing of the interests of backbench members, but I just remind him what the honourable gentleman has just said as he was moving his amendments. We have got to a place with this private members' bill where the government has worked with the honourable gentleman to get it to a shape that the government can support, recognising it is a bill, and it has been taken forward in consultation with the sector. I think rather than blame civil servants and processors for that, I think he could acknowledge that we want to really take the whole sector with us with this bill.
Davis. Well, I'm very good. I'm sure we do. That's why I've been consulting with my local Bradford District Care Trust about the merits of the bill and why some of my amendments are as a direct consequence of the discussions that have been had with the Bradford District Care Trust. The idea that only the government are interested in moving forward with consensus is one that I find rather offensive. I've been trying to move forward with consensus too, as the honourable member for Croydon North knows only too well. And when we get to the stage where government say well, I wish we'd known about some of these amendments earlier, because in that case we may well have been able to accept them. I mean, what on earth is the point of having a deadline for amendments being tabled 3 days beforehand if the government can't organise itself to decide whether or not they should be agreed within that timescale? They should operate like most organisations and businesses do, where they've got a timescale to meet it, rather than pretending that the timescale is of only a passing interest to them. I'll give way to the Minister.
Thank you. This is great fun. I come back to the point. This is a private member's bill, and the government has agreed its position. But the amendment, it is not actually getting in the way of backbench MPs bringing forward amendments, because I will articulate what the government's view is on those proposals, but it will be for the House of Commons to decide.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Minister. I appreciate that we're in a strange situation where the government hasn't got time to whether it can agree them, but it's certainly got time to write speeches on why it disagrees with them, because it isn't in a position to accept them. I mean, it's a completely farcical situation we've got ourselves into. So the Minister's going to be reading out the speech that's been prepared to say why she can't accept these amendments. But we all know the reason she can't accept the amendments is because she hasn't got a department organised to get the things decided within 8 days. And like I say, it gives an impression that the government's been taken hostage by the civil service. I think the Department of Health is probably one of the worst offenders for being taken hostage by its civil servants, and I'm being charitable by saying that because I presume that's the reason why we get so many socialist nanny state proposals coming from the Department of Health. I can't believe the ministers can actually believe in all that rubbish, so it must be the civil servants who are running the department to be bringing forward those things. And it appears that, again, with this particular bill, the civil servants who don't ever want to accept any amendments put forward by anybody other than themselves are doing their best to try and stop any improvements to the bill. And it's just a shame that we've got ourselves into a farcical situation. The Minister's absolutely right. There's nothing to stop members bringing forward amendments. We've seen that. We've tabled them. We all know that there's nothing, and we're very grateful to the Speaker for selecting them, but it's a rather farcical situation we've got ourselves into when we've gone to an awful lot of work, and my staff, I might add as well, have gone to an awful lot of work, Mr Speaker, to try genuinely to improve a bill, to make it better, and then we come across this ridiculous bureaucratic situation, which no doubt applies to every bill. I mean, I've only just found out in the course of this bill. I've no doubt it applies to every bill, but I think it's important that everyone knows that if you table amendments at this stage of the bill, they're wasting the time. It's a completely pointless exercise. I'll give way to my own
but I don't think we are wasting our time if we're tabling amendments, because I still, contrary to what my honourable friend says, I still have faith in the Minister sitting on the front bench that she believes that she is in charge and that she comes to this debate with an open mind, and if, having heard the merits of a particular amendment, she decides she's going to allow that amendment, then she will so say from the dispatch box. But can I also mention another issue with my honourable friend, and that is that often we find, because of the constraints on private members' business, that people say, we'll amend it in the Lords, but then if you amend it in the Lords, then the progress of the bill is jeopardised, because it then has to come back here again to consider the Lords' amendment. So in fact, the government should be being more assiduous and quick in dealing with amendments to private members' bills than to their own legislation.
Well, my own friend is absolutely right. I think he's been slightly naive in thinking that we're going to get some rapid decision making. I mean, the only, as I think, Mr. Speaker, you were alluding to in your response to my point of order, the only time the government appears to be able to act with speed is if they think they're going to lose a vote. Then at that point they seem to be able to react with miraculous speed. We don't seem to need any right rounds at that point, or 8 days of right rounds then. We appear to be able to cobble something together within seconds. Particularly if the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield clicks his fingers, they appear to swoop into action in no time whatsoever. So it seems to me that if honourable members actually want to improve this business, what they should be busily telling their whip is that if we put these things to a vote, and I hope you will allow us some of these divisions to be put to a vote, particularly where the honourable member opposite said he actually agrees with my amendments, Mr. Speaker. If my honourable friends busily say to the whip, actually, do you know what, if this goes to a vote, I'm going to vote for these amendments, perhaps we might have some rapid decision making after all. But we will see, Mr. Speaker. But it's been a rather yet another depressing morning in the history of Parliament for me, finding out actually how this plays. Well, I've only been here 13 years, but I've actually found out today how these things work. I started off cynical and I've become even more cynical, Mr. Speaker, as time has gone on. Anyway, I shall go through the farce of going through my amendments, even though we can't actually make any headway on them. As the honourable gentleman alluded to opposite, amendments 44 to 78 go out throughout the bill, which are changing the wording from use of force to use of restraint. And I was encouraged to hear him say that he had originally believed that the term should be the use of restraint himself, and had been persuaded to change it to use of force, I think he said, by the government. The comments I make here, Mr. Speaker, are largely after consultation with my local Bradford District Care Trust. I believe that the amendments that I've tabled ensure that the terminology used within the bill is actually correct and would be in line with what is commonly used by mental health trusts. The term use of force is one that I submit is one that would be used predominantly by police forces in reference to the use of physical force while carrying out their duties in any particular setting. And it's important to note that whilst the police do play a part in the restraining of patients, it appears to be that the primary focus within this bill is on the restraint methods used by staff whilst in a mental health unit. And while we must not forget that the police are on occasion called to assist in the physical restraint of patients, it would be more appropriate to adopt the correct mental health terminology for actions used predominantly by mental health staff in a mental health setting. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, not only that the use of the word force in this regard is somewhat misleading as well, and suggests that the form of restraint being used on patients is conducted with a degree of aggression, violence or excessive force, which is simply not the case. Restraining a patient, particularly within a mental health unit, I am told often involves little to no use of actual force in the sense that most of us would understand it. The term restraint has been adopted as a common terminology within mental health trusts and covers varying degrees of interaction with a patient. It can be applied, for example, to simply holding out a hand to stop someone advancing towards you, or by methods of calming, such as simply talking to a patient. They are examples of the use of restraint. I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way, and I would just comment on the point that he's making now, that in my experience, both from my time as a minister but also talking to many people in mental health, restraint covers an enormous range of circumstances, from the very light touch to very considerable force, including pinning people to the floor with face-down restraint, which of course was the action that led to the tragic death of Olaseni Lewis. So it's not right to say that it can't involve considerable force. It often does.
I commend the right honourable gentleman. He knows certainly more about this subject than I do, and probably knows more about this subject than anybody in this House, and I commend him for that. Absolutely, I'm certainly not saying that the use of restraint never involves the use of excessive force. It absolutely does. But my point is it often doesn't. And to sort of throw all these things in together in terms of using the word force, I think is not only out of, not within the terminology generally used in mental health trusts, but also I think it's slightly misleading to what is the norm in these areas. Yes, of course.
Thank the honourable member for giving way, and I'm listening with some interest to his speech. The purpose of his amendments, as he said, are to replace the word force with restraint. And he's just given quite a strong list of things that could be restraint, whereas actually surely the whole purpose of this bill is to focus on force, as we've seen defined in other legislation. And I know his doughtiness on issues of nanny state, cotton wool style of politics, that the prospect of doing things like talking to people's smiles, which he described as could be restraint, are the last things we'd want as this type of bill.
Well, I understand the point my honourable friend makes, and I'm going to come on to some of those points later on, because they probably better sit with other amendments that have been tabled. But I certainly accept the point that he makes, and as always, he makes it well. I'm also concerned, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the term force, that it might actually worry people who are thinking about actually seeking some treatment for mental health conditions, that they see things like this, and it might actually scare them into wondering what may happen to them in some of these settings. And I just think that my view is that the word force in this case is not appropriate, not sensible, and not actually what is generally used. So yes, of course, there is a use of force, an element of force used at times to carry out some methods of restraint. But common sense would suggest that the terminology they use in this bill should be what's used by the sector. Yes, of course.
When one looks at the drafting of Clause 1, section 6, references to the use of force are A, to the use of physical, mechanical or chemical restraint. So force is being limited there to restraint, except that they're then adding in B, the isolation of a patient. Isn't this drafting really confusing? Because it's suggesting that the only difference between force and restraint is the addition of isolation of a patient in the definition of use of force.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and he's just made the point I was literally about to make, Mr. Speaker, that he's absolutely right that the reference to use of force is physical restraint, mechanical restraint, and chemical restraint. So I reiterate my earlier point that quite clearly the most appropriate term to use is use of restraint. That's actually what the definition of the use of force is. I think it's sounding something more sinister than it actually is, and it's clearly a more appropriate terminology. So that in a sense, even though I have tabled, I think, over 60 amendments, Mr. Speaker, that deals with over 30 of them, about 35 of them in one fell swoop. But I think that's a more appropriate term, and I hope other people will accept that. Now, if I move on to my other amendments, Amendment 9, Clause 5, removing paragraph C, which is about the training on appropriate use of force, which is about showing respect for diversity generally. That's the bit that I want to remove, which the honourable gentleman mentioned. And now, restoring the faith of the public in their services is a key element of this bill and a key purpose of this bill. And why not? We should all have the confidence of knowing that when we go to any public service, we have the reassurance that we will be treated properly. However, I question when it's suggested that illnesses are not diagnosed in proportion with the demographics of our society, that people draw the wrong conclusion from that. The reality is that we could question, does anything in our daily lives mirror social demographics? Of course not. It would be absurd to think it does. What we need to keep in mind is that any illness, and specifically mental illness, is not selective in who it touches and the outcomes it can cause. It doesn't discriminate in the case of people's ethnicity or sexual orientation or religious belief or gender or in any way. Mental illness particularly is a very complicated and personal experience which, it's well documented, can have a harrowing and life-changing effect on those who are directly affected by it and also the people and families around them. Now, it's been argued that different ethnic groups have different rates and experiences of mental health problems, with people from BAME groups in the UK in particular more likely to be diagnosed with mental health problems and more likely to experience a poor treatment outcome. And while it is documented that for every 1,000 people of the black British population, approximately 41 of those are in contact with secondary mental health services. What's not mentioned so much is that for every 1,000 of the white British population, approximately 37 of those are in contact with the same level of service. In actual numbers, 1.3 million out of the total 1.5 million patients in contact with this service are of a white ethnicity. So the use of the ratio format instead of the actual figures over-exaggerates a point that is already not entirely convincing. For example, I'm looking at the very same statistics for every 1,000 people of the Asian and Asian British population, approximately 26 of those people are also receiving secondary mental health care. In actual numbers, this is again approximately 69,000 patients, higher than the total of mixed ethnicity and other ethnic groups combined, and 16,000 patients more than the black British category. Now, obviously, I clearly don't want to make it sound like a competition in terms of numbers. It clearly isn't. These numbers represent people, and this bill is so far making it appear that there's a problem, that this is an issue that only affects one ethnicity, when quite clearly that is far from the case. The suggestion that there should be a conscious overview of regulating the diagnosis and treatment of a patient, not on their symptoms, but on their ethnic background, may result in turning it into one. By putting in place such measures, the good intentions of stopping ethnic discrimination, the existence of which I would argue are already questionable, will instead create a discrimination against those who are not of a BAME background, or more specifically not of a black British ethnicity, which therefore generates another problem altogether. In the simplest of terms, asking to provide further intensive training on top of what has already been established being at the core of the services currently being provided on unconscious bias and diversity not only creates an unnecessary segregation between patients, but an unwarranted level of being patronising, I think, towards staff. And I'm also, Mr. Speaker, I would draw in parallel the issues that we've seen in London with stop and search, where a very well-meaning intention to try and stop a disproportionate number of black people being stopped and searched has, it seems to me, led directly or indirectly to an increase in the amount of knife crime in London and the number of people who are dying as a result of knife crime in London. Largely, I might add, young black men who have been the victims of that well-meaning policy. And what I fear here, Mr. Speaker, is that staff, rather than being asked to treat people exactly the same, irrespective of people's backgrounds, may well either directly or indirectly, or because they feel some pressure, may start trying to treat people differently as a result. And that, to me, will have serious consequences. And the people I fear who will suffer the most from that will be some of the people from a black and minority ethnic background who will be the people who don't get the treatment that they should get. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you for giving way. Surely the point about an unconscious bias is that it's unconscious. So if you don't collect the data and the evidence to show what is happening to a particular group, it will continue happening because no one's interrogated the data to understand what the problem is. For instance, women are more likely to be restrained than men in mental health services. More women are restrained than men, even though there are more men present in the mental health services. If we don't understand why that's happening, we can't do anything to correct it.
Well, I understand the point that the honourable gentleman makes, and I'm not totally unsympathetic towards it. My point is that I think, my fear is that what will happen as a result of this is that, in effect, staff who have got a very difficult job to do, and it's a very difficult job, and it's difficult enough as it is, and they do a great job. And I think that when we're passing legislation like this, it's important to say, at least in passing, how much we appreciate what the staff do in many of these places, because it's a very difficult job. They are doing their best, often under very difficult circumstances, often with very limited resources. And I don't want to think that the people who are working their socks off we're trying to kick them in the teeth and tell them that they're not doing a good job. On the whole, they are doing a very good job. And my point is, their job is difficult enough as it is. And my fear is that job will be made even harder for them when, in effect, they're subconsciously given the message, as police officers were with stop and search, oh, you want to be careful what you do with different minority groups because you may be accused of being racist if you have too many people from a particular background that you're using restraint on. That's exactly what happened to the police with stop and search. Don't stop, even though you should be stopping and searching somebody. Don't bother, don't do it with somebody from a particular ethnic background because you might be accused of being racist if when it's all totted up you've done it to more black people than white people. We shouldn't put people in that kind of situation. I give way.
To giving way again, but nobody in this bill or elsewhere is advocating proportionality in the way that restraint is used. Merely that the factors that may underpin unconscious bias are understood and articulated.
Philip Davies.
The honourable gentleman's motives are entirely honourable and decent, and I support his motives, absolutely. 100% support his motives. My fear is that in practice what will happen is what I'm fearing will happen. Because I think that's the evidence of what happened with stop and search in London, to be perfectly honest. Exactly the same thing happened. It's not as if we've got no evidence on which to base this. Exactly the same thing happened. If you speak to police officers, they will tell you that they were petrified of stopping people from a particular ethnic background because they feared they were going to be castigated as being racist. That's absolutely what happened. Police officers will tell you that. And all I'm saying is that my fear is that as a result of this, not the intention, I absolutely accept that, but my fear is that may well happen. Now,
yes, of course. I think I'm making an excellent point, and isn't that really illustrated by the fact that substance and drug abuse has developed enormously, particularly in urban areas, as a result of this misguided policy or in relation to stop and search, and it's drug and substance abuse which leads into mental health issues so often.
Yes, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to draw that comparison, but I think it goes to show that often well-meaning initiatives can have the exact opposite result to what was intended. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, diversity training programmes do not show any particular progress in the area that they're trying to improve. In fact, they've often proved to have the opposite effect. In a 2016 edition of the Harvard Business, one article titled "Why Diversity Programmes Fail" states the following: "It shouldn't be surprising that most diversity programmes aren't increasing diversity. Despite a few new bells and whistles, courtesy of big data, companies are basically doubling down on the same approaches they've used since the 1960s, which often makes things worse, not better. Companies have been heavily reliant on diversity training, Mr. Speaker, to reduce workplace bias, in an attempt to reduce such bias during the recruitment process and employee promotions. And studies have shown that this consistent and forceful approach to tackling diversity can activate bias rather than stamping it out. Social studies have found that too often people rebel against rules in a bid to try and assert their autonomy. Therefore, it's argued that companies, and in this case public services, will see far better results when they drop these control tactics to make people conform." So even eminent people at Harvard are not particularly convinced that it would have the result that the honourable gentleman intends. And on top of that, there are so many variations of diversity these days that it would have a vast array of specifics to cover. For example, discussing variations of gender, to my knowledge, I won't test the patience of the House by reading them all out, Mr. Speaker, but I have a list here of 71 variations at least, just on gender. Honourable members who thought there were only two are, I'm afraid, behind the times, well behind the times, Mr. Speaker, if they thought there were only two genders. 71 at the last count. I'm sure my honourable friend from Walsall knows about this, as he's on the Women and Equality Select Committee, which is an esteemed member. I'm sure he can reel them all off on the top of his head. But most people couldn't. Then, of course, that's before, Mr. Speaker, we get on to the variations of religion, which could be discussed. There are estimated to be approximately 4,200 different religions around the world, which go far beyond those more commonly observed in the UK. Beliefs such as that of mysticism, paganism, realism, which is paganism, I think, which has 47 variants within it, Judaism, ghost dance movement, chaos magic, happy science movement, and the one that I personally preferred most of all, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hadn't heard of it before, but I'm thinking about becoming a convert to it, which is the Prince Philip movement, which sounds to me like a marvellous organisation. I've been a great fan of Prince Philip. Of course, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I too, obviously, am a great fan of Prince Philip, but I wonder if, when he talks about the fears that he's expressed, he is, of course, while still being orderly, discussing matters that have gone some way from the central intention of this bill. I wonder if he shares my fear that some of his concerns might actually risk derailing what is still at its heart a very important and sensible measure that we are all surely, as he has said, in support of.
I can't accept that at all, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a delight to see you in the chair. Because I'm actually trying to remove something that is in the bill. And so it's clearly pertinent to the bill if I'm trying to remove something that's in the bill. And no doubt if it wasn't pertinent, Mr. Speaker wouldn't have selected it as an amendment to the bill. So I'm afraid I can't accept his challenge to the chair and the authority of the chair that he's indicating with his intervention. And I'm sure, Madam Deputy Speaker, were I to be out of order, you will be the first to leap to your feet and set me right. So I'm afraid I can't accept his intervention at all. So what I ask, Madam Deputy Speaker, is in terms of all of this diversity training and whatever that I'm trying to remove from the bill, will all of these different religions, genders, all the rest of it, will these be covered in the diversity training? Because we can't ignore that they are in existence and have as much right, presumably, to be detailed in diversity training as anything else. And let's, of course, not forget the diversity in ideological beliefs. Will they also be covered too? And so I'm not entirely sure that this sort of throwaway phrase, which is one of these things that everybody puts into anything, you know, it's one of these meaningless kind of things. There's lots of meaningless things in political discourse, Madam Deputy Speaker. Social justice, you know, everyone's in favour of it. Nobody knows what it is, but everyone's in favour of it. Sustainable development, we're all in favour of that, but nobody's ever been able to tell me actually what it means. But you know, and it goes in diversity training. Let's just shove it in as a little section C on our bill. But nobody really knows what we're trying to achieve by this, and I'm not entirely sure that there's any point to it. And if there is any point to it, my point is that it will be counterproductive. So I really can't accept that aspect of the bill, and that's why my Amendment 9 tries to remove it. Amendment 10 in clause 5 is about training on appropriate use of force. And what I'm doing in Amendment 10, Madam Deputy Speaker, is I'm trying to remove paragraph K, the training of ethical issues associated with the use of force. I'll just say that again, because I think I think people ought to be realising what we're actually doing here, removing the training of ethical issues associated with the use of force. Well, my amendment is trying to make sure that what we do is that we make sure that it's the legal issues that are the focus of the training, not ethical issues, which are, how do you go about talking about the ethical issues of the use of force or restraint? I think, again, as I made the point I made earlier, staff have a very, very difficult job as it is. When they're focusing on whether or not they need or should be using restraint with a particular patient, are we seriously saying that they've got to start considering at that moment the ethical issues associated with the use of restraint? Surely what this House is about is making sure that people act within the framework of the law, not about what I or the honourable gentleman or somebody else thinks are the relevant ethical issues, because how do we decide what those ethical issues are that people should be considering? The ethical issue that I might think is particularly pertinent may be very different to the one that my honourable friend for Christchurch thinks, or maybe which may again be different to the one that the honourable member for Croydon North thinks. What sort of a situation are we putting staff in when they have to be thinking what the ethical issue that was intended with this piece of legislation was? Because I wouldn't be able to explain that to them, and I think we should be removing these bits of flim-flam from the legislation and making sure that what we're asking people to do is follow a legal framework. I'll give way to my...
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. As always, he's making an excellent point. In his extensive researches, has he been able to ascertain the source of the support for this flim-flam which he's describing, and the use of the word ethical? Because we heard from the Minister earlier that this bill has got the support of all, I think she didn't use the word stakeholders, but I think she might have chosen to use that word instead. Where is the evidence that the stakeholders are behind this use of ethical issues being part of the training?
Well, I'm afraid, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can't answer my honourable friend's question. I don't know. And I think I think the Minister was absolutely right to highlight the fact that stakeholders do welcome this bill, but it would be wrong to say that they welcome every provision within this bill. And that's certainly the feedback I've had from my local care trust, that whilst they certainly agree with the thrust of what the bill and many of the provisions within it as well, I might add, there are still some with which they are not comfortable. And I personally, all I can say to I can't tell him about the genesis of this or the widespread level of support for it. Maybe the honourable gentleman can help out, or the Minister can help out. I can't, because I'm not aware of it. All I can say to him is that the definition of ethical is stated as relating to moral principles or the branch knowledge of dealing with these. So I'm not sure whether my honourable friend is any more enlightened by the definition of ethical that members of staff have to take into account. I have no idea what all of that means, to be perfectly honest, and yet we're expecting members of staff who are dealing with patients in difficult situations to be weighing up all of these things. Now, I think it can be established that everyone has their individual take on morals, but surely we can't start applying the ethical and moral views on serious situations such as these. This will end up being the beginning of a long road of other factors that people will be demanded to be mindful of. My view, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that healthcare should be provided in a legal and law-abiding way, not in addition to anybody's personal, individual, ethical take on what is moral and not moral. Of course, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend is making a fascinating speech and seems to be very well researched. I just wondered if there were other elements of law surrounding this topic that included the term or the use of ethics and ethical. Could it be that it needed to be included in order to satisfy some uniformity across different pieces of legislation, given the fact that he may consider it to be flim-flam?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He may well be right. I don't know. I haven't been able to find that evidence, but it may exist somewhere, and maybe the promoter of the bill or the minister will be able to enlighten us. I can't answer his question. He may well be right, but I've not seen any evidence of it, and if he has any evidence of it, I'd be very happy to perhaps change my mind. But from reading it, I can't see any purpose to it, to be perfectly honest. I think it's making... the thrust generally, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that this bill, whilst it should be making staff accountable and institutions accountable, it should also be helping them as well in their daily job. And I think this is making their life far more difficult than it need be. And I don't really see that it's helping protect the rights of patients, which is at the heart of what this bill is supposed to be doing.
Well, my honourable friend,
yes, of course.
Earlier, my honourable friend was referring to the definition of ethics and ethical, but the subsection K, to which he's addressing his remarks, talks about the principal ethical issues, not just all ethical issues, but the principal ethical issues. Has he got any insight into what ethical issues are principal and which are not?
Well, my honourable friend makes a good point. I don't know. But, I mean, who knows? Who knows? It's a mystery to me, and therefore it's almost certainly going to be a mystery to any institution that's trying to implement. And of course, what we've got to bear in mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, this isn't just sort of meaningless. This will be the law of the land. This will, institutions and members of staff could well be taken to court over whether or not they have sufficiently taken into account these principal ethical issues. And surely it would be intolerable to put people in that legal uncertainty. Well, I'm not entirely sure that us passing this piece of legislation have any idea what it means ourselves. So how on earth are the people who are supposed to implement this supposed to get on with it? And surely laws have got to be fit for purpose. And it seems to me that this is going to be a lawyer's drum. You know, I know my friend for Christchurch is an eminent lawyer by background. No doubt his profession will be dancing in the aisles at the prospect of all of this uncertainty, because the only people who are going to benefit from this are them. I don't think the patients are going to benefit, and the staff certainly aren't, the institutions aren't, who are probably going to find themselves facing expensive legal suits. Unless it is simply a benefit for the legal profession, I can't really see any point to it whatsoever. Anyway, Amendment 11, Madam Deputy Speaker, where I'm confident of scoring a few more runs on, because the Honourable Member for Croydon North indicated in his opening remarks that he supported Amendment 11. So maybe one that I indicated to Mr Speaker at the start, we may want to push to a division if we may, to test the will of the House on this matter. This is to insert a new paragraph L, again relating to the training on appropriate use of force. And this would be for the training for mental health staff on who is responsible and the roles and procedure when the police are called to assist. Now, I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that some people may say, and I wouldn't necessarily dismiss it out of hand, that the training clause 5, to which I'm referring, may already be too prescriptive. I mean, there is an argument for saying that actually we should be taking out all of these detailed things that people should be trained under, and leave it in effect to institutions to sort out the training for themselves and the experts locally, rather than it being actually in statute every little element of what that training should consist of. I think there certainly is an argument for saying that we should, get rid of all of these detailed areas to prescribe where training is, because of course the problem with prescribing everything is that what will happen is that everything will be covered that is prescribed, but nothing else will be, and there may well be something that's been missed out, and if it's not on the list, they won't bother with it. That's my problem. So given that we are prescribing so much, it seems to me that it's absolutely essential that we make sure we get those things right, otherwise important things will be missed off in the training. So it seems to me we either go one of two ways. We don't prescribe any of it, or we prescribe everything, because otherwise things will be missed out. I think the Honourable Gentleman indicated he wanted to come in.
To him giving way. I suspect he and I actually agree that it is really important to protect the individual against the overbearing power of the state. And actually, what this bill is primarily about is achieving that, to protect individuals who are often in very vulnerable positions against, in a sense, potential misuse of power. And so giving some detail about what the training must cover so as to ensure that people are treated with respect, with dignity, and protecting their rights, surely is something that he would actually agree is rather important.
Yes, absolutely, I do. I'm not sure that anybody would argue that it isn't. Absolutely, nobody disagrees with that. The issue is how we best ensure that the training that is given is comprehensive and covers areas that need to be covered. That's the issue. Now, my point is that there's two ways of doing that in terms of the law. Either we can just simply say that training should be given and leave it in effect to the experts in the field to determine what should be covered by that. That's one option. Now, this bill has gone a different way, which I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. You can argue both ways. What we're doing here is we're literally prescribing in the law what should be covered in that training. Given that we're going down that route, Madam Deputy Speaker, it seems to me, therefore, that where things are missing from that list, it's essential that they are included in that list. Because if you don't include them in that list, what any institution will do is they will look at what their legal responsibility is to cover. They will cover all of those, and that will be it. They won't cover anything else, because they will have presumed, not unreasonably, that what's been produced for them is an exhaustive list of what should be covered. And so my amendments 11 and 12 are merely to highlight that there are important things that I believe have been missed off that list that are absolutely essential, should be covered. Now, the Honourable Gentleman, when he opened the baton in this debate, was very, very kindly said that actually he agreed that these things were important issues that should be included in the training, and therefore should be, he supported them. Now, his issue about whether they should be included in the bill was about whether or not it could be simply covered off in guidance. And maybe the Minister may have something to say about that. I don't understand this, Madam Deputy Speaker. It appears that the government hasn't got the authority to agree to put these things into the bill, but miraculously they do have the authority to agree it should go in guidance. Well, if they've got the authority to agree it should go in guidance, why on earth haven't they got the authority to agree it should go in the bill? It makes no sense to me, but that's the beauties of the establishment. Yes, of course, Alan.
Just to advise my honourable friend, the guidance that we will be issuing under this bill will be subject to consultation, and I can fully anticipate we could actually pick up the themes he's mentioning in his amendments as part of that consultation.
Well, I'm very grateful. As I suggested, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've got the authority to put it into guidance, but not into the bill. I don't understand that, but there you go. That's the vagaries of the establishment and the executive for you. My point is this, Madam Deputy Speaker, putting it in guidance, and this is the point that I want the Honourable Member for Croydon North to note, given that it is his bill, is that where you've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 or 12 things that are in statute, putting two others in guidance doesn't really cut the mustard, because they're not statute, they're guidance. What institutions will focus on is what is the law. What can they be taken to court for if they don't actually do it properly? And it seems to me that you can't start having a pick and mix effort where you put some of these things in the law and some of these things in guidance, because by definition, the things that are in guidance are clearly not as important as the things that are in law, by definition. And my contention is that the amendments that I've made, 11 and 12, as the Honourable Gentleman said he agreed with, it seems to me that they are so important, they should be part of this list that goes into the law. Guidance just isn't good enough. It's just not acceptable. So Amendment 11 is to insert new paragraph L, which would say that training for mental health staff, it's about training for mental health staff on who is responsible and the roles and procedures when the police are called to assist. This amendment will ensure that there is a structured approach to the involvement of the police when restraining a patient. For me, this amendment goes absolutely to the heart of one of the purposes behind this bill in the first place. This is one of the reasons why the Honourable Gentleman brought forward the bill, in my opinion. It would be extraordinary if the bill didn't include training on the thing that's central to the bill. This particular amendment stems from that inspiration. The member for Croydon North has detailed on several occasions in this chamber the case of his constituent, Olashaney Lewis, and the treatment he received in the lead up to his death. And on reading through the inquest into Mr Lewis's death, alongside the coroner's reports, there were a number of things that stood out to me. Predominantly, the fact, I believe it can be agreed, that the entire scenario that took place on the evening of his death was a mess. It was a shambles, the things that happened that should not have happened. There seemed to be a sudden shed of responsibility from the medical staff to the police, and I'm of the belief that this caused the quality of medical care that Mr Lewis received to be compromised on that occasion. What I find to be most disturbing is that the police, who seem to be blamed for Mr Lewis's death, yet his cause of death has been identified by the coroner as that of a medical negligence. I therefore ask this: what responsibility do the medical staff have in events such as these, and what responsibility do the police have? This goes to the fundamental to this particular case that brought this bill. Now, common sense would suggest to me that if a patient is in a medical unit and experiencing an episode of mental illness, that the priority for medical staff will be to control the situation, and due to the cause of the situation being medical, and that the police are purely there to assist in actually giving somebody the appropriate medical care and treatment. An interesting case in relation to this would also be that of the former Premier League footballer Dalian Atkinson, who died in the early hours of Monday the 15th of August 2016. Police were called to attend a report of concern for safety. Neighbours had reported that Mr Atkinson was banging and kicking on his father's front door after flying into the quote was, flying into a booze-fuelled rage. They had also reported that Mr Atkinson was trying to enter his father's property as he claimed that he was homeless. Mr Atkinson's father, who was not the person who called the police, stated of his son, "I don't know if he was drunk or on drugs, but he was very agitated and his mind was upset. He was threatening and very upset." At the time of the incident, Mr Atkinson was reported to have been suffering for some time from a series of illnesses which left him in a fragile state with a weakened heart. Alongside pneumonia and liver problems, Mr Atkinson was also said to have undergone dialysis for kidney failure and was battling depression. Mr Atkinson's brother, Ken Roy, stated that on the night of his death, Mr Atkinson had a tube in his shoulder for the dialysis, which he had removed himself, leaving him covered in blood. He said that his brother had attacked their father, who was 85, and held him by the throat, telling him that he was going to kill him, and told him that he had already killed his sister and another of his brothers, which was not true. What makes Mr Atkinson's case different from Mr Lewis's is that instead of force used from person-to-person contact, Mr Atkinson was subjected to the use of a taser gun. This, with the combination of multiple health issues and a weak heart, caused him to suffer cardiac arrest and subsequently brought him to his death. In the days following his death, Mr Atkinson's nephew, Fabian Atkinson, said of his uncle, he had some health issues that he was trying to get through, and that's why his heart was weak. When a taser is deployed, as soon as the taser is deployed, they need to automatically call an ambulance. How do they know the health of the guy or the girl that they are affecting? And that's exactly my point, Madam Deputy Speaker. When police are called to a scene, they are not aware of a person's medical history. They can't possibly be aware of that. There's no briefing beforehand because it's simply not possible, because it's an urgent situation that they're being put into. Training is designed to attend to incidents and de-escalate them quickly and efficiently. The question therefore needs to be, how is it possible for this to be done and take on the additional task of medical assessment? It would be assumed that by being in a medical setting, there would be the reassurance of having a medical professional there to monitor the health. In the Royal College of Emergency Medicine's best practice guidance, it is advised if a patient is being restrained in the emergency department, even if the police are providing this intervention, ultimate responsibility for the patient's safety and well-being rests with the doctors and nurses of the emergency department. And I think this is absolutely crucial, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, of course, those guidelines are if a patient is brought into accident and emergency. I appreciate that. Mr. Lewis was in a specialist mental health unit where there were medically trained staff who should have been well versed in these situations. Yet they seemed, from reading the reports, and people may have a different interpretation, but it seemed that they felt it's appropriate to pass the responsibility of Mr. Lewis's medical well-being to the police officers, who are of course not medical professionals. And I believe that was the most detrimental part in the last moments of Mr. Lewis's life, and that's why this should be one of the key focuses of the bill. In the Memorandum of Understanding, the police use of restraint in mental health and learning disability settings, the College of Policing states, people who talked to us wanted mental health staff to be proactive and use their therapeutic skills to de-escalate the situation and only call on the police when absolutely necessary, and that each situation where the police are called for emergency assistance should be properly assessed on its merits, and the police role is the prevention of crime and prevention of persons and property from criminal acts. This, I think, gives a very clear definition between the responsibility of the services. In case it wasn't already apparent, the police are responsible for crime, the medical staff are responsible for health. What I don't want is that police have to be given a full medical briefing before assisting with the restraint of a patient. In most cases, there simply won't be time. So there needs to be an understanding of the cooperation between both the medical services and the police, with the medical staff giving direction to the police. Therefore, I ask that this amendment is made that ensures the staff are given clear training to alleviate the possibility of a similar chaotic scenario arising, where is the involvement of the police when restraining a patient, and that they are fully aware that the police are to assist and not to take over the additional responsibilities that otherwise would be of medical staff. And it seems to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, this amendment goes to the heart of what this bill is trying to achieve. It goes to the heart of trying to stop anyone suffering in the same way that Mr. Lewis suffered on that particular occasion. And I don't really see how this bill can be fit for purpose unless it specifically includes that particular part of the training in the statute, in the bill. If it doesn't, then I don't think we are being diligent in making sure that the situation that happened to Mr. Lewis, terrible situation, that the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to bring to the attention of this House and try and resolve. My amendment actually is the thing that most helps to resolve that particular scenario, and it is not right that it is not in the bill. And I hope that members of this House will overcome the bureaucratic nature of government and actually insist that this particular amendment goes into the bill, as I would like to see, and as the promoter of the bill has said he would like to see too. And it's our job to make this bill fit for purpose. Amendment 12 in clause 5, which is in the same area, Madam Deputy Speaker, training on appropriate use of force. This is to insert another new paragraph, paragraph M, which again I think is a really important thing that has been missed out of the bill in this list of areas that must be covered in training, and that is training on acute behavioural disturbance. This amendment will ensure that there is staff awareness training on acute behavioural disturbance, which can be life-threatening when paired with restraint techniques on a patient. Again, I refer to the case of Olashaney Lewis and his cause of death, which was detailed by the coroner as such: hypoxic brain injury caused by restraint in association with acute behavioural disturbance, also known as ABD. It states in the circumstances of death that Mr. Lewis became agitated and fearful, resisting efforts to leave him alone in the seclusion room. Officers restrained him but were unable to regain control. Eventually, Mr. Lewis became unconscious and suffered cardiac arrest. Hypoxic brain injury, or hypoxia, is caused by an interruption to the constant flow of oxygen that the brain requires. The brain uses 20% of the body's oxygen intake to survive, and it is needed to make use of glucose, which is its main energy source. Interruption of the oxygen supply causes a disturbance in the brain function, and therefore will cause immediate and irreversible damage. It can take as little as 15 seconds to fall unconscious from lack of oxygen, and damage begins to take place after 4 minutes. Hypoxia is not something that is easily identified at the beginning of an examination, since the primary cause for it is too often unrelated to the brain. Common causes for it can be low blood pressure, heavy blood loss such as a hemorrhage, suffocation, choking, strangulation, asthma attack, drowning, exposure to high altitudes, smoke inhalation, carbon monoxide inhalation, poisoning, drug overdose, electric shock, and predominantly, as was the case for Mr. Lewis, cardiac arrest and heart failure. It is the acute behavioural disturbance element of this, referred to by the coroner in Mr. Lewis's case, that I feel will be the most beneficial to add to the training. And I want to just explore this further, because according to the guidelines written by the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine, acute behavioural disturbance may occur secondary to substance misuse, intoxication and withdrawal, physical illness such as post-head injury and hyperglycemia, and psychiatric conditions such as psychotic and personality disorders. Of all the forms of acute behavioural disturbance, excited delirium is the most extreme form and potentially life-threatening. Similar to abnormal brain function, it can cause a loss of consciousness, confusion, stupor and agitation, which is the contributing factor to causing the characteristic outburst of violence. The agitation element of the symptoms can stem from several causes, as stated in Module 4 of the Personal Safety Manual from the College of Policing. They are as follows: acute brain inflammation, such as meningitis, limited oxygen supply to the brain, such as acute pneumonia or heart attack, metabolic problems. Diabetes can cause high or low blood sugars, both of which can cause severe changes in personality and behaviour, from sleepiness to agitation, and can be lethal if untreated. And general illness, severe sepsis, can cause confusion. It then goes on to list the symptoms that are associated with more severe agitation, which are as follows: psychiatric illness, acute intoxication with a broad range of drugs or withdrawal from them, and acute brain injury such as a stroke. Aside from violent behaviour, other clinical symptoms may include impaired thinking, disorientation, hallucinations, acute onset of paranoia and panic, shouting, unexpected physical strength, sudden tranquility after frenzied activity or vice versa, high mental and psychological arousal, aggression and hostility, insensitivity to pain, and incapacitated sprays. Reading through the transcripts of the coroner's court inquest, it is very apparent that these symptoms were present in Mr. Lewis at the time. He appeared to be demonstrating signs of hyperpyrexia, an extreme fever usually over 106 degrees, which one of the police officers on the scene, PC Michael Aldridge, commented on in the inquest. I came onto the ward and saw Mr. Lewis sweating profusely. His clothes were soaked, he said. Of course, Mr. Lewis would have been terrified. He's experienced psychosis, he's been held in a hospital and he wants to leave. He's surrounded by several uniformed officers and medical staff. Sweating would be understandable, but to the point that his clothes are soaked through as if he had just stepped out of a shower, I am sure that this would have been noticeable to anyone, particularly to medical staff who I am of the belief should have been looking out for such symptoms. Mr. Lewis was already established to have been violent and aggressive, symptoms of his psychosis. He had kicked and broken a door and was said to have been aggressive towards staff who claimed to have been in fear for their own safety. To reiterate this, the hospital night site manager, Hilda Abben, at the time stated, I told staff to give him intramuscular medication because he was apparently refusing oral medication. and because of his level of violent aggression, it was decided during the staff handover that he would be sectioned, and that was so the intramuscular medication could be given against his wishes. The nursing assistant also stated Mr. Lewis was physically violent and would put me and my colleagues in danger. PC Michael Aldridge also commented, on sighting us, he moved at speed to our position, crouched forward, shouting he wanted to get out. It was nearly all over, repeating it again and again. Mr. Lewis presented a possible risk to others on the corridor and he damaged the door. He was really strong. So, the point is, Madam Deputy Speaker, Mr. Lewis was showing at least 4 of the 14 previously mentioned symptoms for ABD. Violence, aggression, agitation and hostility. Along with the previously mentioned hyperpyrexia, his apparent state of panic, shouting, paranoia and heightened physical strength makes it 9 out of the 14 symptoms. So this begs the question, why was it not picked up on by the medical staff that Mr. Lewis was experiencing ABD? Further glaring signs of ABD being present in Mr. Lewis were revealed by another of the police officers, PC Adam Mitchell, who stated he was growling with every breath he exhaled. The sound and tone didn't suggest he had difficulty breathing, more something on the inside of him, an aggression and a ferociousness that couldn't be controlled. Putting this into context, by this point Mr. Lewis was being restrained on the floor by several police officers, had 2 sets of handcuffs on and 2 sets of leg restraints, and had been struck with a baton during a compliance procedure, yet appeared not to be in pain. I am of the belief that he was therefore demonstrating the insensitivity to pain that is one of the clear symptoms. The terms ABD or excited delirium were reportedly never mentioned during the events leading up to the death of Mr. Lewis. Yet it was plain to see that Mr. Lewis was experiencing it. Had it have been identified at the time, it seems that the outcome certainly could and probably would have been very different. For example, referring back to the ABD guidelines from the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine, the suggested steps to take when dealing with ABD are as follows. Ideally, individuals with acute behavioural disturbance should not be taken into a custody suite, but directly to an emergency department. However, on occasions, individuals will be detained by the police and taken to the police station. The forensic physician will be called for advice. In these circumstances, the forensic physician may consider that immediate hospitalisation is required and advise the police to ring 999 for an ambulance. Otherwise, the forensic physician should attend and assess the detainee. It goes on to say the forensic physician should endeavour to establish the underlying diagnosis behind the acute behavioural disturbance before making a treatment decision. The doctor should then consider allowing a period of de-escalation where the detainee may calm down away from arresting officers. The forensic physician should avoid responding to aggression and adopt a reassuring and non-judgmental attitude. Only when de-escalation has failed to curb the disturbed behaviour should the forensic physician consider giving him medication. Looking through the Coroner's Court inquest into police and custody related deaths, I found another case which mentioned acute behavioural disturbance as the cause of death, which is that of Michael James Sweeney in April 2011. However, unlike Mr. Lewis, Mr. Sweeney was a sporadic user of cocaine on a recreational basis. In the coroner's report into Mr. Sweeney's death, it said, following the cocaine ingestion, Mr. Sweeney entered a public house with a knife. He was extremely agitated. The Metropolitan Police Service was called and officers attended shortly thereafter. Police officers almost immediately identified Mr. Sweeney as being unwell, suspecting that he was suffering from what had been described in their training as excited delirium. They correctly categorised this condition as a medical emergency and asked police control to arrange for an ambulance to be sent. Police control contacted ambulance control. London Ambulance Service categorised the call as C1 Amber rather than Red 1 or Red 2. At the time, there were no paramedics located in the ambulance control room who could have recognised the seriousness of the condition and upgraded the call, but that has since changed. 20 minutes after police first rushed for an ambulance, they took the decision to transport Mr. Sweeney to the Royal London Hospital in a police van. Once at hospital, police officers, medical and nursing staff were challenged by the situation. Mr. Sweeney remained violently agitated and demonstrated extraordinary strength in trying to hurt himself and resisting efforts to help him. He was restrained in prone position until sedation was effective and was then turned over. Unfortunately, he arrested within a minute and then died less than 2 hours later. Like Mr. Lewis, Mr. Sweeney was subjected to a lack of knowledge about his medical situation. While he was fortunate to have police officers to attend to him who had been given good training in identifying ABD, it was again the medical services that had failed him. Ambulance services who were responsible for categorising the severity of medical cases failed to identify Mr. Sweeney as an emergency and thereafter left it to the police to transport him to hospital. To reiterate my earlier amendment on the roles and responsibilities of the involvement of police assistants, why should it be the responsibility of the police to conduct the work of medical emergency staff? In response to Mr. Sweeney's death, the coroner detailed his concerns in the report as police officers had clearly been trained in the condition described to them as excited delirium. The training was effective in facilitating their understanding of Mr. Sweeney's condition as a medical emergency. However, this term is not widely used in this country, and neither ambulance, nursing, nor even some of the medical staff had heard of it in April 2011. It would be possible to give the ambulance and hospital personnel an understanding of the term excited delirium. However, given that this describes a medical condition, it seems more logical for the police to follow health services in this rather than the other way round. Indeed, this is correct. It would be more logical. However, lessons have clearly not been learned, and Mr. Lewis was failed, like Mr. Sweeney, by medical professionals, and even worse, failed by those who were supposed to be specialists in mental health, because they didn't have the knowledge of these key areas of mental health, and in relation to the core focus of this bill, which is using forms of restraint for his particular condition. This is definitely an area that needs to be brought to the forefront of training in mental health, and is already an area that other services have made a start with addressing. In May 2016, changes to standard operating procedures were given to police forces across the UK to reflect new mental health procedures to help officers identify ABD in people. In the procedures it states, the purpose of the procedure is to ensure that officers and staff recognise the heightened risks associated to acute behavioural disturbance, excited delirium during and post-restraint, including the immediate emergency actions that need to be taken. Officers and staff are requested to ensure they familiarise themselves with symptoms and summary of guidelines for restraint and the management of this condition. Acute behavioural disturbance is to be treated as a medical emergency. ABD and ED is a rare form of severe mania, sometimes considered as part of the spectrum of manic depressive psychosis and chronic schizophrenia. Persons suffering from ABD and ED are highly vulnerable to sudden death from cardiac arrest during or shortly after a strenuous struggle. This is a development in training, Madam Deputy Speaker, where predominantly ABD or ED, I understand, were not commonly mentioned. I have been told that most police officers have never heard of ABD and were not aware of the symptoms. Of those police officers that had heard of it, they had joined the force more recently than those who had not heard of ABD and knew very little of the consequences of the disorder. Police officers had often identified the symptoms of ABD as simply that of an alcohol or drug misuse, and therefore categorised these incidents as simply violent and aggressive behaviour. It's important to note that ABD can stem from several other contributing factors to agitation, aside from psychosis and substance abuse. Metabolic problems, diabetes for example, can cause changes to blood sugar levels, causing severe personality changes. Acute brain inflammation, limited of oxygen supply to the brain, which can be caused by conditions such as pneumonia, and broader, more general illnesses such as severe sepsis. This means that acute behavioural disturbance could be a far more common issue than people think, particularly given when you tot up how many people have those conditions. Referring back to the revised procedure on this, there has been a concerted effort made to ensure that officers are better equipped with the knowledge of how to recognise these symptoms more readily and less likely to be confused with general aggressiveness. In it, it states, many of the signs indicating ABD-ED are common to anyone behaving violently. Therefore, it is important for officers and staff to recognise the difference between acute behavioural disturbance and a violent outburst. It then goes on to list the symptoms I have principally mentioned, along with additional ones, such as constant physical exercise without fatigue, excessive strength, continued struggle despite restraint, acute psychosis with fear of impending doom, hypothermia, abnormally rapid breathing, and abnormally rapid heart rate. Officers and staff must recognise the heightened risk factors: a person intoxicated with alcohol or drugs, a person substantially overweight, a person suffering respiratory muscle fatigue or exhaustion. My point is that if other public services are making an effort to do awareness training on this, like the police, why is it that the primary service dealing with these things is not making such an effort to do so? I will even go far as to say that in many respects, I don't know whether it's laziness or whether it's ignorance, I don't know what it is. But it is absolutely unacceptable that training is not given as a matter of routine to people in mental health institutions, given the issues that I've just raised. I think it's deplorable that they could be potentially be a life-saving training topic is being left to the police to try and deal with it. Are we going to really end up with in a country where we have to rely on the police to aid in these medical ailments? I sincerely hope not. Mental health is already an area that's been highlighted as having a lack of knowledge surrounding it, and this amendment, to me, isn't a nice to have on the end of it. This is absolutely crucial in the evolving area of mental health. It's impossible to argue, to me, why it should not be in the bill. And I know that the member for Croydon North is in agreement as to how beneficial it would be. I mean, really, is there anyone else in this House who could possibly disagree that this should be on the list of areas in the statute that should be covered for training among staff? How can we have, as in my contention, the two most important areas of training that the bill is seeking to deal with in the case of Mr Lewis not even covered, and that we may put it in guidance at a later date? That is not good enough. It is not good enough. These things must be on the face of the bill. They must be on the face of the bill. And I hope that we make sure that the government makes sure that these two amendments, I'm grateful that the Honourable Member for Croydon North accepts that these should be included. I'm grateful to him. It's our job in this House to make sure that the government also puts this in the bill, given that I suspect that if they had the time to consider it, they would have agreed with it too. So let's force them to do it. And I hope the Minister will, having listened to those cases, will actually decide that, never mind right rounds, these things need to go in the bill today. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful. On that point, I certainly agree with my honourable friend on the necessity of putting these two amendments onto the face of the bill, and I think everybody who's been listening to his speech will be of the same opinion. And I just wondered whether he'd be able to tempt the Minister to rise in her place now in an intervention and say that, having heard the compelling case my honourable friends put forward, that the government will indeed accept amendments 11 and 12.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Of course, if the Minister wishes to intervene, I'm not going to stop her. I see her rising to her feet.
I'm happy to give some clarifications to the government's position on this issue. I think when I discussed these amendments with my honourable friend, I did emphasise to him that we did not feel that his amendments were necessary. And I can advise him that there is already a memorandum of understanding about police involvement in existence already. The Mental Health Act has been amended to emphasise that people in mental health settings should be in clinical settings with clinical care. And the Angelini report states specifically that agreement should be in place between health partners and the police, which emphasises that health takes the lead on the use of force, in line with the principles of the already existing national memorandum of understanding. So I say again, I do not believe that my honourable friend's amendments are necessary.
Well, there you go, Madam Deputy Speaker. I mean, what can you say? The sort of civil service script has been brandished. There's always a reason in the civil service why you shouldn't do anything. But all I can say to the Minister is, to be perfectly honest, the idea that it's not necessary could apply to every single individual one of the things that is already listed in those. If you wanted to go down that line, You could say, well, all of these things are being done anyway, individually by this person or that person or whatever. Either there's got to be a comprehensive list of things that the government feels is essential, must be covered off in the training, or it doesn't. And how on earth, knowing the situation that happened to Mr. Lewis and those other cases I've mentioned, how anybody can stand up and say, actually, having listened to that, we don't think these things are absolutely necessary, is literally, frankly, beyond belief. Literally beyond belief, Madam Deputy Speaker. You literally couldn't make it up. It's a shameful situation that we've got ourselves into, to be perfectly honest. And you know, I'll let people decide for themselves which side of that. I hope we can test the will of the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, on those amendments, and we can see what people make of those amendments and whether or not they want to be in the civil service box of deciding nothing needs to be done, having listened to those cases. We'll let the House make its mind up. And that's that, Madam Deputy Speaker. Amendment 14...
When looking at these amendments about the contents of what should be in the training, has my honourable friend had a chance to look at my Amendment 98, which would introduce into clause 5.2a the involvement of patients and their families in the planning, development and delivery of care and treatment? Because it seems from the cases that he cited that family involvement can be of crucial importance, and this should be also part of the training.
Yes. Well, the answer to my honourable friend's question is yes. I have looked at his amendment, and I agree with it. If he'll allow me, I had planned on going through my amendments first before moving on to other people's amendments later. So I had got his amendment in my sights, but if he'll allow me, I'll come to it later on. But he's right. It is an amendment I have seen, I have read, and I do very much agree with it. My next amendment, Madam Deputy Speaker, is Amendment 14, which moves us on to Clause 7 of the bill, subsection 2. This is the reporting the use of force, saying the reporting the use of force does not apply where the use of force is negligible, amending to include restraint that does not include physical contact. This amendment is to ensure that there is not a series of pointless recording of every interaction with a patient that falls under the category of restraint. I'm still using the word restraint. I appreciate that I'm in danger of, at the end of these amendments, losing the battle and it's going to be called force. But for the purposes of putting forward my amendments, I'm going to still call them restraint, as I'm seeking to do. The word restraint is defined in the dictionary as deprivation or restriction of liberty or freedom of action or movement. However, again, it must be reiterated that this can be conducted in the most subtle of ways. The law entitles people to freedom of movement, providing they are not harming others or themselves whilst exercising that right. NHS services have variations in their policies within the different trusts. Overall, the guidance for all medical staff follow the same basic principles. However, specific details are more varied. It would be fair to say that physical restraint is considered as a last resort approach among health trusts across the board, and following the exhaustion of all other methods. Staff are advised to call for the assistance of security when physical restraint is considered, as they will have been trained in restraint techniques. The Bradford District Care Trust, for example, advised that the assistance of police is only called as a final resort when usual restraint methods have failed and there is a serious concern for the safety of the patient, staff or other patients on the ward. And I've been told that as a general rule, a patient would have to be exhibiting sustained high levels of physical aggression, often involving some kind of weapon, before the police are called. Some services, such as the London Ambulance Service, apply a different approach and advise that police are called at the earliest possibility of physical restraint being required. This is due to the London Ambulance Service not providing their staff with training on physical restraint, therefore leaving them vulnerable and reliant on the backup of police services. In all cases of restraint, staff are required to apply the principle of using the least restrictive and most proportionate option to control behaviour for the least amount of time as possible. Again, the word proportionate is reiterated throughout the guidelines for restraint, reminding us that it is consistently a factor of consideration when restraint is conducted. The type of restraint are broken into three categories: which is low-level restraint, an intervention that prevents a person from behaving in a way that threatens to cause harm to themselves, to others, or to trust property and or equipment. Physical restraint, any manually applied method, physical or mechanical material or equipment that immobilises or reduces the ability of a person to move their arm, legs, body or head freely. And chemical restraint, a drug or medication used to manage a patient's extremely violent or aggressive behaviour, which is administered if necessary against the patient's wishes. Such drugs may of course also be used in circumstances in which the threat of harm is less immediate, with the patient's consent or in the assessed best interest of a patient who lacks capacity. Low-level or psychological restraint methods are the initial exercises which are conducted to try and prevent a situation from escalating quickly. Most often this will be a variation of calming methods, less restrictive than other categories, which could ultimately allow the patient to have a time out in isolation to calm down. Essentially, this can be as simple as telling someone not to do something, or depriving individuals of equipment or possessions which may enable them to do what they otherwise would do. For example, removing glasses, hearing aids, mobility aids. This is less invasive and is more frequently used with those who suffer with dementia. The less invasive approach to patients allows them to retain a certain element of control themselves over the outcome. It's these less invasive approaches that I feel will be what falls into the loophole of being constantly recorded and taking time away from the carers and the care trusts, from the patients that actually need the help. The key restraint methods that this bill are concerned about are those that require an element of physical contact and those that should be reported appropriately. And therefore I think it's important that we make sure that we remove from the need to report things that are really very minor in nature and are not really, I don't think, at the heart of what this bill was about. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to group a few together here in the interests of, of time. Amendment 15 and 17 is in clause 7 is about recording the use of force. There I want to is removing paragraph K and is about recording the relevant characteristics of the patient. I want to remove that bit. Removing subsections 9 and 10, which list the relevant characteristics of a patient, race, sexuality, etc., etc. Amendments 21, 22, 23 to 30 and 31 in clause 7, which is about recording the use of force, and clause 8, the statistics prepared by the mental health institutions. And there, what I want to do in Amendment 21 is insert new paragraph G, which would include the relevant characteristics of the staff involved, if known. Amendment to subsection 9 is changing the list to be relevant characteristics of both patient and staff, making the list plural to cover both patient and staff, and the relevant characteristics of the staff involved. Amendments 32 to 35 in clause 7 about the recording the use of force, and there I want to remove paragraph C, E, F and H, which is about the patient's marriage status, race, religion and sexual orientation. These amendments, Madam Deputy Speaker, are to remove these unnecessary labelling of patients. I'm not one of putting people into categories and not a fan of labels. In my mind, instead of not factoring in the things that people complain about, for me, it should be irrelevant. All of these things are irrelevant. They're absolutely irrelevant in the treatment of people with mental health problems, and we shouldn't be getting bogged down in listing everybody's gender, race, sexual orientation, marital status. I mean, it's irrelevant. They're irrelevant to the treatment of people with mental health problems. And we shouldn't be bogging down the staff with all of this political correctness, to be perfectly honest, Madam Deputy Speaker.
And isn't it extraordinary that in the list to which my honourable friend is referring, there's no reference as to whether or not the patient has actually got any family or relatives?
Well, again, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and you could argue that that actually is something that is important, that should be logged. I'm sure we would all want to involve the family in these discussions about the treatment of their family members, and again, that may well have helped in the case of Mr. Lewis. And so, yes, it is extraordinary that the bit that could actually be relevant to the treatment of a patient isn't included, and all of this other stuff, which is completely irrelevant to their treatment, is included. And you know, it just seems to me like unnecessary PC. The idea that when recording the use of force, the information needs to include race in order to help tackle the issue of racism, sexuality to tackle the issue of homophobia, and sexual orientation and gender to avoid sexism will do nothing to aid any of the individual patients at hand. Surely we should agree that if we believe in equality, all of those things are irrelevant, and we shouldn't be pointing out people's differences. That can't be changed. They're not relevant, and we shouldn't be passing legislation which tries to make them an important part of treating people with mental health conditions. However, if there is an insistence that we're going to go down this route, then it seems to me that I'm confused why it's only the recording of a patient characteristics is being logged and not actually the person who is actually giving out the treatment. Because if there is any kind of institutional racism or whatever it is that people are going to try and hang a hat on as a result of this, then surely the characteristics of the person giving out the use of force must be relevant in this picture. Surely a complete picture can never be grasped just by getting the characteristic of the patient. And so if we are trying to uncover, which I think is what the Honourable Gentleman is trying to do, areas of whether he calls it unconscious bias or whether it wants to be called institutional racism or whatever people have their different terminology they want to hang a hat on. Surely this is absolutely crucial. It can't be done without this amendment, Amendment 21. He indicated he had sympathy with my Amendment 21 in his opening remarks, and I'm grateful to him for that. I would hope he agrees that it's not just useful, that if we're going down this route, it's essential that this information is collected. This bill is also asking that the police are to wear body-worn videos to literally give a full picture of their involvement in these cases. And so why are we only reporting one side of the story when the police are not there? By adding the relevant characteristics of the staff into the report, the actual statistics that are recorded might actually give a better representation of the matter at hand. However, my feeling is that the reason that this amendment was not originally added was because it might indeed highlight a very different narrative to which some people would like to present. One particular concern I have is that these reports will be used to try and back up the questionable argument of institutional racism in the health service, when in fact studies have shown there to be a lack of early diagnosis of mental illness, and in this case psychosis, due to a lack of trust in mental health services from people of BAME communities. Again, it is consistently documented that patients, particularly of African and African Caribbean backgrounds, are more likely to be diagnosed with a form of psychosis and enter into the mental health care system via, therefore, a more confrontational approach than through a routine appointment with a GP. Again, this is the basis for the argument of institutional racism. But it should be considered that the suggestion of institutional racism within mental health is what is preventing people from seeking help, early medical help in the first place. It's actually not helping the situation, it's making the situation worse by telling them don't enter these services because there's institutional racism in there, and that isn't really helping anybody. And importantly, the genuine present issues that need to be questioned are whether or not patients are being treated early enough in their illnesses, and are the treatments sufficient in providing patients with the ability to sustain good mental well-being in the future. And it strikes me that by having a huge section in this area, we're getting bogged down in stuff that really isn't important at all. Really, I'm not really sure whether this was just an afterthought, we'll lob this in as well, or whether this was supposed to be central to the bill. I don't know. But it seems to me that this really isn't going to help anybody with their mental health treatment. It's just going to help lots of politically correct organisations around the country start stamping their feet and saying that the public sector is institutionally racist. And I don't believe that is the case, to be perfectly honest. I don't believe that is the case. And I don't think there's much evidence to suggest it, as I said at the start of my remarks. Amendment 16 in clause 7 is about recording the use of force. And this is subsection 6, is record keeping the use of force, inserted a new paragraph 6a that records of use of force should be added to the patient's medical records. Now, again, I would like to think that this is a rather obvious and sensible thing that should be included in the bill. I have a feeling that the honourable gentleman opposite would be quite sympathetic to this too. This would ensure that the use of restraint against a patient would be documented on their records, and therefore would be very helpful when knowing how to deal with that patient in the future. If it's already been documented and what happened on a previous occasion, so that somebody who didn't happen to be there at the time, or a new member of staff, or whatever it might be that comes in there, will readily have access to that information that I think is absolutely crucial in how people should or shouldn't be treated in any particular circumstance. It's worth bearing in mind that a key argument in favour of the bill is that there is no consideration for if the patient has experienced a history of abuse or violence, and that therefore there are some forms of restraint that they should not be exposed to. However, the one thing that's missing in the middle of all this is the reporting and statistic taking and analysis is the care plan of the patient. These restraint techniques are for the purposes of preventing the patient from causing harm to themselves and others around them when they are in what could arguably be a very dark and turbulent period in their life. These restraint methods are being branded as tactics to control and humiliate patients when in actual fact they are part of a broader care plan to protect the patient, and that often seems to be forgotten. In simple terms, they can form a part of the patient's overall treatment. And I found it astounding, really, that this is something that's not going to be included in the bill if the government doesn't change its mind. All of these instances should be documented in individual medical notes. Now, I understand. I'll give way to my own friend.
I think we've all got constituency cases where people suffering from mental illness are shifted from one location to another, from one clinical commissioning group area to another, from one part of the country to another. I've even got a constituency case at the moment where somebody's being told that they've got to go up to Manchester in order to be able to get treatment for a mental condition. But it's all the more important if these people are being dealt with in different locations in the country, that there is one set of medical notes which records everything that's happened.
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a very good point. I hadn't mentioned the fact that people might be moved from one institution to another, and of course that makes it even more important. And look, I'm not for excessive bureaucracy and all the rest of it. But this seems to me again to be an essential part of what the bill's seeking to achieve. And I think the theme of my amendments has been actually to try and deliver what the purpose of the bill was at the very start. That's been the theme of all my amendments, certainly not to weaken it. If anything, it's to want the honourable member to go further in some of these things. And I think again that this isn't again just a nice thing to tag on. I think this goes to the heart of what this bill should be about. Restraint techniques should be documented in medical notes to provide other medical practitioners who are treating the same patient, give them an overview of how that individual patient responds to treatments using that form of restraint. And I can't really see why that would not be a part of this bill. Yes.
I'm sorry to intervene on him because I know he's trying to be as brief and succinct as he can possibly be. But I take his point about the medical records. I like him, I suspect, believe strongly in patient empowerment. And I think there is a case for what he's arguing at the moment, the records of restraint being included in the patient's medical notes. But I'm loath to support changes to the face of the legislation when we haven't consulted with either the patient groups or with the medical professionals. And given that it's possible to do that after the legislation is enacted, because it's not on the face of the legislation, through guidance, and if the Minister would give that assurance, I would be satisfied to deal with it that way, because it meets the very objective the honourable gentleman is arguing for.
Well, look, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said right at the very start, I genuinely appreciate the constructive way the honourable gentleman has approached this bill. I really do, and he's given another indication of it there. The point is, and this is the dilemma we always seem to have on a Friday, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that do we sort of just let something rush through that we know really is not really as it should be and it should be better or whatever, and we'll try and patch up the little things after with a bit of sticking plaster here and a bit of sticking plaster there, and we'll cover this up by doing that and whatever and all the rest of it? Or do we actually make an effort to make sure that the bill goes into being properly and in a fit state the first time round? Now, the honourable gentleman is arguing, not on reason, it's a perfectly respectable position to hold, that what we'll do is we'll sort of gloss over the fact that there's lots of really important things missing, and what we'll do, we'll have a little big sticking plaster called guidance, and we'll have a big sort of thing that goes out to everyone saying, here's some guidance. We forgot to put this in the bill, by the way, but actually it should have gone in the bill. We didn't sort it out in time. Parliament couldn't be bothered to do its job properly, so we're now adding a tag on with guidance, and here's a list of all the things that you should and shouldn't be doing. That's the case that the honourable gentleman makes. It's a perfectly reasonable case to make. I'd probably rather take the view that when we pass legislation in this House, we should be a bit more mindful of the people who are having to implement it, and make sure that it's fit for purpose the first time round. That's my particular view. Now, it seems to me that there's an opportunity here where everybody can be satisfied. Because the last thing that we want, Madam Deputy, is for this bill not to go onto the statute book. This is broadly, with the reservations I've explained, a good piece of legislation. But I think there's an opportunity to make it better. Now, there's two choices, really, that we seem to have. There's three choices. The first choice is, which is the ideal choice, is that this House today puts this bill into a proper shape and accepts some of these amendments that I think quite clearly are necessary, and the honourable gentleman accepts that some of them would have been in the bill, should be in the bill himself. We can go for the sticking plaster route, where we cock it all up ourselves and then try and put a sticking plaster over it called guidance and hope that everyone who is responsible sorts it all out. Or we've got a third way, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we can have another slot for this bill at a future date to give the government time to consider its things, do its right round, for the honourable gentleman to do a bit of more consultation and get a date later in the year where it can go through, hopefully, with some of these amendments either agreed or not agreed based on the right rounds of the consultation. That seems to me to be the most sensible way of going about it, because I think what's important is that we get a sensible piece of legislation on the statute book. There are plenty of other days left in this session in order to do that, and I don't think that just putting everything that should be in the bill in guidance at the end really does it for me, personally. I might do it for him, might do it for the Minister, might get us over a little hurdle, but I don't really think that that's the way to pass legislation in this House. I really genuinely don't think that that is the best way to pass legislation in this House.
I think my honourable friend sets out three options very, very clearly, and if we went for the last of those options, then it would give the government an opportunity to produce the draft guidance so that we could see what's going to be in this guidance, because what's concerned me so far is that the Minister has said that quite a lot of the things that my honourable friend and I think should be on the face of the bill, she thinks that they're not necessary, and she's not even saying that they should be included in the guidance. If we get the draft guidance, then we actually be able to see where we stand.
Well, I think my honourable friend is right, because the Minister who's doing her best, she doesn't decide the government bureaucratic nonsense, that decision-making strategies and all the rest of it. It's not her fault. She's sort of left in a difficult situation. I'm the first to appreciate that. The point is that what we're getting at the moment, as my honourable friend says, we're not even getting a guarantee that these things will be in the guidance. We're getting a thing that they might be dealt with in the guidance. There's a expectation even that they could be. Well, Madam, I've been here long enough, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I've been shafted before on these private members' bills where I've been promised that an amendment's going to be tabled in the Lords to deal with something and whatever and all the rest of it, and then it never happens. Never happens, Madam Deputy Speaker. So a bird in the hand is certainly worth more than two in the bush, and particularly when it comes to government promises on amendments and guidance, in my experience, and that's not a party political point either. I think both sides have been guilty of that in the past. So I'm probably looking for a bit more than a sort of a waft here and a waft there that it might be covered in guidance. I'm looking for something a bit more concrete than that. And I don't think really it does the Honourable Gentleman's Bill justice for it to go through Parliament with it being not in a fit state. And I think we all want to see that happen. So anyway, amendments 18 to 20 that I tabled in clause 12 relate to police body cameras. My subsections 1 and 2 are changing that police must take video recording to should try to. And I also want to remove subsections 4 and 5, which make police liable to criminal proceedings if they fail to take video. Now, as the College of Policing have stated, it is an indisputable fact in today's society that law enforcement officers carrying out their duties and the tactics used by them are under greater scrutiny than ever before. And that's a good thing. And I've got to say, Madam Speaker, I am a massive fan of police body-worn cameras. I think it's absolutely fantastic for the interests of justice. I think it safeguards the reputation of police officers who often face vexatious complaints, and it can be produced to show that actually what they did more often than not was absolutely right. And and that is almost always the case, and it's fantastic for the courts because they can actually see at first hand what actually happened rather than maybe some conflicting accounts of what happened where the court is invited to believe one witness over another or whatever. So I'm a big fan of these things. And modern methods of detailing interactions with the public by the police are often that of body-worn video cameras. Its aim is to improve the accountability and transparency of police conduct when it encounters the public. It's a move that the Home Office highlighted at the time of its launch as being the technology of the future and as a means to help save police time and improve working practices too. General procedure for using the devices is that they are to be used only for the recording of encounters with the public and are not to be constantly recording for the duration of a shift. That's the procedures, that they shouldn't be used for the duration of a shift. West Yorkshire Police, which is obviously my area, Madam Deputy Speaker, their policy on body-worn video in particular advises that it is to be used where a degree of investigation or exercising police powers is required, unless there is a good reason not to. The rationale for not using body-worn video cameras may need to be explained at a later stage and justified to a supervisor and or during court proceedings. The recording must be proportionate and the effect it may have on individuals and their privacy must be taken into account. The cameras are advised to be switched on the moment the incident becomes apparent, and in some cases this may be en route to the incident. However, it is stated that officers must announce that they are using the recording equipment in clear wording. For example, I am wearing and using body-worn video. I just need to tell you that you are being videoed and audio recorded. Recordings that are taken are stored on the camera until they are returned to their docking station at the police station. From there, clips are downloaded from the camera and sent to the central system for viewing. It's key to note that these clips cannot be altered, changed or deleted by the officer in any way at all, and therefore keeps it completely authentic for evidence purposes. The cameras themselves do differ between forces. At present there are a couple of varying ones available and their performances is equally as variable. More common amongst forces, like with West Yorkshire Police, are the reveal cameras. The device itself is rectangular in shape, with a large proportion of the device being a screen showing the person that they are being recorded. The camera at the top of it is on a rotating axle, so that it can be adjusted and repositioned for each time it's used. It also has a switch at the side to flip up and down to switch it on, and operates a red light which flashes to draw attention to the fact that it's recording. Alongside the flashing, it's also said to make a loud beeping noise, for the same purpose as the flashing light, which I've been told is irritating and, to be honest, probably unnecessary. In essence, it's designed to be simple to use in short notice. The effectiveness of such technology is quite clear. Results from randomised control trials have shown that there has been an improved efficiency of delivering criminal justice for cases via an increase in early pleas or higher prosecution rates. Alongside, it's noted that the benefits of using these cameras may include improving public confidence, reducing crime incidents, reduce the number of complaints made against police officers, and provide a useful tool for the training and professional development of police officers. A US study examining the use of these cameras, which was published in a scientific journal, was conducted in California in 2014. In it, they examined the impact of body-worn video by measuring the number of incidents of police use of force and complaints used where officers' shifts were assigned to either an intervention, with cameras recording all contact with the public, a total of 489 shifts, or a control without cameras, a total of 499 shifts. The main findings were that body-worn video reduced police use of force by 50%. This was also reflected in the number of complaints reducing from 24 in the previous year to just 3 in the year of the study. The authors of the study speculated that the videotaping of police-public interactions may result in socially desirable responses, meaning that when people know they are being recorded, they tend to exhibit more desirable behaviours and are more likely to follow the rules of contact. In the UK, there were several trials of body-worn video ahead of a wider rollout. Hampshire Constabulary in 2013-14 conducted trials of it, and overall their findings were found to be relatively positive. They noticed there were a small number of reductions in the overall occurrence of incidents classified as crimes when comparing before and after pilots with other regions. When interviewed, police officers recommended that they should focus on incidents most positively affected by body-worn video, such as low-level and high-volume incidents of public order and antisocial behaviour. In a public survey following this, it was found that 90% thought that these cameras could help the police gather evidence, identify criminals and increase the likelihood of successful convictions. At a trial in 2006-7, Renfrewshire and Aberdeen, there were also some positive outcomes. Like Hampshire, there were the praises of the technology making the public feel safer and improved public confidence in the police. There were more technical issues with the cameras though. And since 2013, officers of Police Scotland have recorded a total of 302 faults with the equipment, with the total number of problems reportedly doubling from 57 in 2014 to 120 in 2016. It's estimated that the cameras are deployed up to 50,000 times annually in Scotland alone, and it's therefore claimed that the number of reported incidents each year are approximately 0.03%. The percentage may not seem a lot, but in real terms that is still a large number of incidents that are not being recorded because of problems with the equipment. The faults themselves are varying, ranging from inability to download videos, digitally assigned cameras to officers, recordings from previous shifts still present on the camera, to more functional issues being that of short battery life and cameras taking a long time to warm up when turning on. Now these are absolutely pertinent when putting in provisions in the bill like this, Madam Deputy Speaker. More recent generations of this technology have worked towards combating these issues. The on-off switch now automatically switches on with virtually no warm-up time necessary. Battery capacity are designed to now cover the recording requirements of an entire shift, with the recording capacity to support a 2 to 3 hour video, and the officers are also being given option to charge the camera remotely via USB. The success of body-worn video has prompted other services to review how it could play a part in their working life, and recent trials have taken place with Barnsley Hospital NHS Foundation Trust and their security department. The main issue they were trying to combat was antisocial behaviour and aggression towards staff, which they stated as being generally from disruptive patients who were the primary force behind the decision to use these cameras. Aggressive behaviour is divided into two categories, medical and non-medical, which is clearly unique to the NHS. The vast majority of assaults on staff are non-deliberate or medical violence which derives from patients who are unwell. And primarily they stated that the move was to give the ability to collect evidence when needed to share with the police. During the pilot phase, for example, one of the on-site hospital shops was burgled, and because the security officer present had used the body camera to record the incident, the footage was able to be shared with the police. From this, Barnsley Hospital NHS Foundation Trust found that as a deterrence measure, the cameras provided excellent support. As a direct result of wearing the body camera, security staff were reporting that violence towards them had decreased dramatically, with violence and aggression issues reducing by 80% across the Christmas period. For the full duration of the 12-month trial, it was reported that violence and aggression, both medical and non-medical, had reduced by 12%, which they believed was due to the video cameras. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Birmingham, also conducted a trial with the aim of decreasing violence and aggression, and during their study they encountered one particular patient who was known for fabricating allegations of being touched inappropriately when assisted by staff. And in summary, the hospital found that the camera provided a useful tool in protecting the patients and staff from any potential threat of sexual assault, or alternatively the fabrication of allegations of sexual assault. In short, I'm in agreement that the use of body-worn video is beneficial to both the public and the professionals who use them. The trials conducted by the police have shown that the benefits of using this equipment far outweigh any disadvantages. And with technology developing at such a rapid pace, the opportunities for recording these detailed accounts will give the ability for our services to conduct their work with the security of reliable and unlimited technology. What must be considered is the extending the use of body-worn video fully to other services outside of the police. The trials in the NHS which I've detailed above show that there is clear need for them, and it should be considered as part of this bill. To reiterate, I do not mean that all NHS staff should be equipped with a camera. It should be issued for the use of those who are trained to and conduct restraint on the patients. This, like the police, should then be downloaded onto a centralised system and added to the restraint data which the trusts already collect to be viewed. Again, it must be observed that written data on restraint is collected by hospital trusts. As I previously mentioned, however, the video of such a restraint will allow a full picture of the restraint to be observed for evidential justification for the actions taken. My point is, in relation to this amendment, there are varying factors to take into account for the absence of a police video, and I don't feel that they've been necessarily taken into account in this bill. Stating that officers must take a video is not factoring in that there are simply scenarios when it is either not possible to do so, or there are mitigating circumstances that will prevent them from doing so. Body-worn video has had a marked improvement on reporting crime and has been rolled out to other services. Further to this, there are simple technology failures that would make it difficult to produce a video, and making a police officer liable to criminal proceedings because they haven't taken a video, I think is excessive and absurd. Yes, I will.
Thank the honourable member for giving way, and it's always a pleasure to get an extended opportunity to hear him speak on a bill. Would he, though, agree with me that actually the amendment he's proposing would take away must to should consider, when there's already the issue of being, if reasonably practical, in the bill, in the same way as his Amendment 19 would introduce a rather vague concept of trying to, which is perhaps a point in legislation which usually on members are very doughty in taking things that are vague out of, wanting to take things vague out of legislation, yet in these two amendments he wants to put them in.
Yes, I understand the point my honourable friend makes. I'm equally not very keen on unnecessarily criminalising decent police officers, to be perfectly honest. And my fear is, and I know my honourable friend doesn't have that fear, but my fear is that that may well be what happens. And it may well be, Madam Deputy Speaker, that at the end of a long disciplinary process and trial they're acquitted. It often happens for police officers. But that doesn't underestimate the hurt they go through when they have to go through all of that. And so what I'm trying to stop is some unnecessary discipline and criminal procedures being taken against police officers, whatever the... I'll give way to him again.
Yeah, thank the member for briefly giving way again. Would he recall, though, in his examples of the pilots, his body-worn cameras see over 90% reduction in complaints against the police, which deal with the very points he makes?
Yes, I made it clear. I support the use of them, and I want to encourage the use of them. But there may be occasions when, for whatever reason, they weren't able to be used. And the wording does say must. It does say must in the word. I'll give way to the Minister.
Thank you. I have to say, I completely agree with the points that my honourable friend is making here. And
could the Minister just turn this way because people want to hear what she's saying?
My apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is precisely to address my honourable friend's concerns that the term, when is practicable, was placed on the face of the bill. And just to clarify, I mean, what we do not want to happen is for the fact that a police officer isn't wearing a camera to impede him from doing what's right in this context, and that's why we put that on the face of the bill. He's raised concerns about the potential for criminalisation of police officers. Again, that is not our intention. The subsections he refers to are consistent with those in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and they're there just to remind police of their obligations. But I can just give absolute reassurance. He rightly draws attention to the fact that Cameras protect police officers as well as their patients. As a force of transparency, they're an effective tool. And I just want to give him my reassurance that the concerns that he's addressing are addressed in the bill.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Minister for that, and I'm sure police officers will be very grateful for that intervention too. I just feel that there are occasions when it may have been practical to do it, but for whatever reason, under the pressure of the time and the situation that they came to, they forgot. It was practical for them to do so. They just, because of the heat of the situation and whatever, they forgot. And I wonder what's going to happen in those cases. It may well be that it was practical for them to do so, but because of the points I made about the noises that they make, the flashing lights and whatever, they thought, actually, do you know what, in this circumstance, I'm not sure I'm going to do it because it might make this patient worse. And they don't do it. It was practical for them to do it, but they didn't. And I worry that there are not sufficient loopholes, so to speak, for police officers who are trying to do the right thing, who put themselves in difficult situations, and that we're just, in effect, trying to make things very difficult for them. And I fear that there will be, at some point, a criminal proceeding brought against a police officer, when really it should never have been brought as a result of this bill. And it's all right saying, well, you know, we don't think that will happen. These things do happen. That's my fear, and I want the law to be so worded to make that as little likely as possible. That's my only concern. We will see whether or not my fears are realised or not in the future. I'll give way to my...
Exactly, I'm grateful for my friend giving way. But is there any evidence to suggest that police won't want to protect themselves by taking body cameras to such incidents? Why do we need this in the bill at all?
Well, I think my friend makes a good point. The evidence is that the biggest supporters of body-worn video cameras are police officers themselves. And actually, they're crying out for them, and they want to use them more often. They're the ones who are wanting longer battery life on them so that it can be used more often, etc. So I agree. I think it is entirely unnecessary. And I just think, do we really need to be going down the road of criminalising a police officer because they might have forgotten to do it? Not that it wasn't practical. Might have been entirely practical. They just forgot to do it. Should that really be a criminal offence? You know, I'm very dubious about this, and I think we need to be giving more support to our police officers, not trying to make their life harder. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, they're the amendments I've tabled to the bill. But as you've noticed, there are a number of amendments tabled by other members, and I wanted to start with new clauses 1 and 2. Tabled by the Honourable Member for Croydon North, where he wants to, which is amendment, so new clause 1 and 2. Now, I contacted Bradford District Care Trust about these very points. I understand the motivation of what the Honourable Gentleman's seeking. It's a perfectly reasonable thing that he said in his remarks. You know, that you know, if there's a death at the hands of the police, there's a independent police complaints commission or whatever I think they've got a new title these days, which and all the rest of it. So, why should deaths be not subject to a similar procedure? I think it's a perfectly respectable point, and I've got every sympathy for that view. I should just say, I did just want to say that I did actually. Contact my local trust about these points. Now, they did say, and I think it is worth putting on the record, that the death of a patient under the circumstances really covered by this bill would be investigated as a serious incident anyway, in line with NHS England's serious incident framework. And once a serious incident has been identified, there are 12 weeks in which to complete the root cause investigation and report. The family of the deceased will be invited to be involved in that process from the outset. The only thing that might prevent them from proceeding with an SI investigation will be if the police told us not to for fear of prejudice in their own investigation. In other words, the initial NHS-led investigation would be very quick. Now, obviously, the NHS, the care trust can't speak for the police's investigations. I will in a second. But the point that they wanted to make was if an independent external review is also required, that could take a very, very long time indeed, which might be an unintended negative effect of insisting that all inpatient deaths are automatically subject to external review. Of course, I'll give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and on this point, I'm looking forward to hearing from the Minister, who I believe has some proposals to make about how we take this forward. But on that point, I wonder if I could take the opportunity to welcome to the Chamber Shelley Lewis's parents, Adji and Conrad Lewis, who, following the tragic death of their son in 2010, because of a botched internal investigation, then had to fight for 7 years to secure an inquest to find out what had happened to their son, why he had died, and to secure the modicum of justice that surely they, as bereaved parents, deserved right from the start.
Well, I'm very grateful for that intervention, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I very much welcome them too. And I salute them for everything that they've done in his honour, in Mr Lewis's honour, absolutely. And all I would say to them is two things. They've got a fantastic Member of Parliament who's done a great job representing their interests in the House, and they should be very proud of their Member of Parliament. And that we, I think, are all agreed that it's essential that we make sure that we pass laws in this House, and hopefully through this bill, that make sure that what happened to him will never happen to anybody else ever again. And I think that's something that unites everybody in this debate, whatever our individual view is on any individual amendment. I'll give way to the...
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way, and I'm conscious that he's now been speaking for 2 hours. And he's been raising legitimate points, but I feel very passionately that this bill has to be passed into law, and I know that very many other members of Parliament share that view. And I have a very real concern, and I don't think it's his intention, but I hope it isn't, that we could end up with this being talked out today, and the risk then that this bill is lost, and that would be a tragedy if that happened. And I just would urge him to allow other members to contribute to this debate so that we can reach a conclusion on this.
Well, I hear what he said. He clearly hasn't heard what I've said, Madam Deputy Speaker. The bill wouldn't be lost, as he well knows. He's been here long enough to know exactly how the procedures in this House work. This bill, as it was already we have in its report stage, would very easily slot to the top of the queue of a future date of a bill, and could go through at that point. And hopefully it could go through in a better state once the government's had the time to look at the amendments that it needs to look at in order to make the changes that the honourable gentleman opposite has agreed should be in the bill. All I'm seeking to do is actually to deliver the bill that the honourable gentleman opposite would like to see the bill wants to be in the bill. I'll give way to it.
Just on the point he just made, while I agree with him that there are changes in the bill, changes I would like to see as a result of the legislation, I am perfectly happy to accept the Minister's assurances in dealing with them through guidance.
Well, we've been around that particular issue, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't intend to revisit it again, but you know, for me, what the fundamental amendments of 11 and 12, which I went through at some length, which go to the very heart of what happened to Mr Lewis on that terrible occasion, which would actually give the training to staff to make sure that those things couldn't happen again, are absolutely essential to be in the bill and not just added on as part of guidance, which we hope may or may not be covered off by individual trusts. I think we've got a duty to make sure that those things that happened to Mr Lewis are absolutely covered in the training given to staff, and that's what we should be doing. Yes,
I'm grateful, Honourable Friend, and I think he's absolutely right not to fall foul of the scaremongering, because we are fortunate we've got a much longer session this time. There are still extra Fridays which the government has not yet announced is going to be available for the discussion of private members' bills. And I think it's unthinkable that a bill like this, which is supported by everybody in the chamber today, it's supported by the government, it's supported by the opposition, but where there's need for further improvement, that why don't we have the bill improved rather than put it on the statute book in an imperfect state, knowing jolly well how difficult it is to bring forward amendments later through a further private members' bills. Let's make this a good bill.
Well, I'm very grateful. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is the opportunity, if the bill doesn't pass through through today, it will definitely pass through at some point later on. It will definitely pass through. But if it doesn't pass through today, it won't be my fault, Madam Deputy Speaker. the government has got every opportunity still. We've still got 2.5 hours to go, for goodness sake. The government's got plenty of opportunity to say that it will accept Amendments 11 and 12. And if the government says it will accept Amendments 11 and 12, the bill will go through today. If it needs more time in order to do a right round, in order to get 11 and 12 agreed, well, then it's going to have more time to get 11 and 12 agreed. I mean, that is literally not in my hands. That's in the government's hands. So if the government wants this bill to go through today, it only has to, I hope the minister's going to make us all happy.
Well, again, I say to my old friend, he is mischaracterising the government's position. The government's position is that these amendments are not necessary. I mean, on the specifics about the role and responsibility of police officers on these occasions, as I've already outlined to the House, these are subject to a Memorandum of Understanding, a Memorandum of Understanding that has actually been led on by the College of Policing, of which he's already given some praise. So I say again, I asked my honourable friend to withdraw these amendments because they are not necessary.
Well, maybe when the Minister gets to speak, she can tell us which of the amendments the government would accept if it could get its right round sorted out in time, because the information, well, that's not what the Minister indicates from a sedentary position, none. That is absolutely not what the government communicated to me yesterday. Absolutely not what the government communicated to me yesterday. The government communicated to me yesterday, and I quote, "I wish we'd had these amendments earlier." That flies in the face of that. But anyway, I'll give way to them.
Thank you. I think we've, as honourable as members, we've had 6 months, I think, to put in amendments. So perhaps the honourable member could have speeded up a bit with his amendments. I just wanted to make the point, whilst supporting my friend, the honourable member for Croydon North, and his bill, that there is a suggestion that the bill needs to be improved, and of course we must all look to what improvements could be made. But I would point out that the organisations that support this bill in its current state include the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Royal College of Nurses, the CQC, NHS England, Young Minds, Mind, Agenda, Rethink Mental Health, Inquest, the GMB and Unison. And with all those very good organisations supporting this bill, perhaps we can try and make progress and get through today. Thank you.
Well, I don't believe the Honourable Lady has been here throughout the course of the debate, so if she had done, she would have appreciated that we all support the bill, and that the honourable gentleman opposite supports the bill in its current form. But during the course of the debate, it's also become apparent that he actually agrees that the bill would be improved with these changes made to it. So it's not a question of whether we support the bill or not. We all support the bill. The question is whether or not we get a bill that is fit for purpose, and that we get the best possible bill going through this House. Because the point is, once these things have gone through this House, that'll be it. It'll be off this House's agenda. It'll have moved on. We won't get another chance to do the great things that the honourable gentleman's trying to do here. We've got to get it right this time, otherwise the opportunity will pass. And those absolutely 2 key bits of training that are needed to stop anything happening to people that happened to Mr Lewis need to be on the face of the bill, and that's blindingly obvious to anybody. They need to be on the face of the bill, to be perfectly honest. I'll give way to the honourable.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Are we not in danger of allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good?
Well, on that basis, my honourable friend is basically saying, well, let's get a bill with a nice title, with any old sort of nice sounding provisions in it, and let's just let it through without any scrutiny whatsoever, and bang it onto the statute book. And the whole point of the report stage of bills is to seek to improve them. And actually, I'm still confident that people will actually decide that what I'm saying is sensible. These are sensible improvements to the bill. It's not my fault that the government can't get its decision making in terms. No, that's not my fault. The whole point, to address the honourable lady's point, the whole point of having amendments tabled on a Tuesday evening for Friday is to give people time to consider them. I'll give way to the promoter of the bill.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. If he would be generous enough to draw his remarks to a close within a reasonably short period of time, that would allow the Minister to speak and put on the record how the government intends to deal with some of the issues that he's raising quite rightly and quite legitimately. But my belief is there are other ways of dealing with these that would allow the legislation to go forward, to proceed this morning.
Yes, we've heard these ways. There are guidance. We're going to basically cover everything off that wasn't in the bill that should be in the bill with guidance. It seems to me the Minister's made it abundantly clear that she's now hardening her position as every minute goes on, that she's now gone from saying that, you know, we've gone from a situation where if only we'd had the amendments earlier we would have done something about them, to now they're not necessary, to now we don't agree with any of them. We don't agree with any of them now is what the latest indication. I'll give way.
I would have appreciated cited amendments earlier, not least so that we could have had a sensible discussion about how to achieve the outcomes he wanted to by his amendments. I'm very clear that we can do that through guidance, which we'll be bringing forward in consultation with the sector, as we have throughout the passage of this bill. And, you know, guidance is statutory guidance, and all institutions will have to have regard to the content of it. We are at a position in time, given the timetable. We've got to this position through dialogue with the sector. We've gone through parliamentary scrutiny. But this is not the only opportunity to bring forward legislation in this sphere. For example, we have the Health Service Investigation Branch legislation currently being consulted on as we speak. We have the review of the Mental Health Act taking place as we speak. This will not be the only opportunity for my honourable friend to bring forward proposals for legislation.
Well, the only problem with that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we're going to end up in the same game again, where I'm going to propose an amendment and the government's going to say we haven't had time to do a right round on it. You know, I mean, I don't even follow what the government's position is anymore, because it started off by saying that we've now gone from saying we wish we'd had these amendments earlier, which the Minister's just reiterated again then, we wish we'd had these amendments earlier, to then saying that they're not necessary, to then, well, she says no they're not. Then she's saying they're going to be covered in guidance. Well, if they're not necessary, why would she put them in guidance if they're not necessary? I mean, we're going to have to start getting our story straight. Are these things necessary or not?
I mean, the honourable gentleman has been a member of Parliament for a lot longer than I have, but he will be aware that bills have the principles of legislation, and it is standard practice for the detail under that bill to be enshrined in guidance.
But we don't know what's going to be in this guidance, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm basically making the case that it's absolutely essential that the two amendments that I tabled, 11 and 12, which the Honourable Gentleman for Croydon North said quite clearly in his speech that he agreed with, amendments 11 and 12, he thought they should be in the bill as well. And he's trying to find a compromise way. I appreciate that, but strictly speaking, he'd be happy for them to be in the bill too. I think they should be in the bill. He thinks they should be in the bill. The Minister hasn't even made a commitment that these specific amendments would be in the guidance. I mean, I'm literally being offered nothing really. I mean, apart from just saying, oh well, look, this bill's, we know it's not good enough, we'll try and sort out a bit of guidance here and there, just let it through. It's not perfect, but just let it through because it's got a worthy sentiment behind it. We've got to start treating legislation with a bit more respect in this place. The Minister said it's gone through parliamentary scrutiny. This is parliamentary scrutiny. This is the report stage of the bill, for goodness sake.
Well, I'm grateful to my own friend for giving way. I mean, the government's line seems to be that this is a very urgent measure. If it's so urgent, can I ask the Minister, through you, Madam Deputy Speaker, what state the guidance has reached?
An intervention on Mr Davies.
I will invite my honourable friend to ask the Minister whether she agrees that because of the urgency of this, the guidance is already in draft in her office and it can be laid before the House tomorrow or the next couple of weeks. Because I suspect that the guidance hasn't even really begun to be drafted, and we need the guidance before this would ever be able to take effect.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Absolutely, it appears to me, at any rate, I don't know about anyone else, but it appears that the sort of government are making things up as it's just going as they're going along in order to sort of desperately try and get this bill through in any form whatsoever, whether it's good, perfect, indifferent, is neither here nor there. Just so presumably at next questions it can say we got the mental health unit's use of force bill through Parliament and all the rest of it. Well, you know, if we just want to pass any old legislation and put a few decent clauses in there and hope that will do the job, I'm afraid that's not That's not what this House should be about. It's about saying that we've identified areas where the bill should be strengthened, and therefore we've got a duty to find a way to do that. And if the government won't agree to do it today, then I'm afraid we'll have to try and make sure it does it in future. But what I'm determined is that this bill will go through in a proper form that will help stop what happened to Mr Lewis ever happen again. We've got to be back to the central point of why the honourable gentleman brought forward this bill. The points I'm focusing on are at the heart of exactly the purpose behind his bill. They're not things that are just sort of useful add-ons here and there, or useful. They actually go to the very heart of why he brought forward this bill in the first place. And I don't really see why he should be so complacent about letting it through without those things being included in the bill. Anyway, people have put forward amendments that deserve to be scrutinised. The honourable member for North Norfolk put forward quite a few. He is basically wanting to include in his in the use of force. He wants to include in that the threat of force as well as the use of force, adding in that the threat of restraint of a patient or the threat of force of a patient is considered the same as using force in effect. I'm afraid I can't agree with that particular amendment. Actually, we don't want to be deterring people from warning of the threat of force when warning of the threat of force may actually stop force having to be used in the first place. I don't really see how the threat of force can be treated in exactly the same way as using force. I think it seems to me to be often a legitimate restraint technique. So I actually think it might make the actual use of force more likely if staff aren't actually threatening to use force before they actually use it. So I don't agree with that. I'll give way to my own friend.
And of course it would all have to be recorded, wouldn't it? Every threat of the use of force would have to be recorded. But the threats of use of force were included in the original draft of this bill, and that was taken out during the committee stage. So I didn't understand why the Right Honourable Member wants to include it again.
Yes, well, I agree, and I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, the same applies to his Amendment 41, which includes the threat of isolation to go along with isolation itself, and 42, where he also wants to include the coercion of a patient. And I'm not really entirely sure what the need of such an amendment is, to be perfectly honest. He includes in Amendment 43 a definition of coercion, which is the use or threat of force with the intention of causing fear, alarm or distress to control a patient's behaviour or elicit compliance with the application of a use of force. I'm not really sure what that in particular adds to this particular bill, to be perfectly honest, and anything it does add to the bill I don't think is something that I could support anyway. I think he's taken these definitions a bit too far for what the purpose of the bill actually is. His Amendment 37 is about Clause 3, page 3, line 2, inserting a policy published under this section must set out that the use of force will only be used without the sole intention of inflicting pain, suffering or humiliation, or subjecting patients to torturous or inhumane or degrading treatment, or without inflicting punishment or intimidation. Well, it seems to me if somebody's using force for the sole intention of inflicting pain, suffering or surely that must already be illegal. Sure, I can't believe that can already be lawful in this country. I look to people who are more legally qualified than me, but surely that must already be illegal. I can't believe that is necessary either. Then he talks about Amendment 36, which is about the description of each of the methods of restraint that may be used in the what steps will be taken to reduce and minimise the use of force. Of the description of the techniques used, and D, which is the worst bit of this, which is a commitment to reducing the overall use of force in the mental health unit. Well, would that mean potentially that restraint and force wasn't being used when it should be, simply because somebody has got a commitment to reduce the overall use of force? I mean, surely what we should be seeking to do here is making sure that the use of restraint and force is used appropriately at the right times, in the right situations with the right patients. Surely then, whatever, as long as that's being done, the number of those things is in effect neither here nor there. It's surely the appropriateness that matters, not the actual numbers. And so it seems to me that what the effect of this amendment would be was that the restraint wouldn't be used when it should be used. And again, for that reason, the sort of lack of trust we have of staff in this is something that, again, I can't possibly support. Is Amendment 38, Clause 4, page 3, line 8, saying that under subsection 1 must include a patient's right to advocacy and how to assess an advocate. Again, I think that this may again deter staff from using restraint even when it's necessary, thinking that we're going to get into a compensation culture with vexatious legal claims being made against them, and I don't really think we should be passing laws that encourage that to be done. Amendment 79, the Secretary of State must publish quality standards for training, and the Secretary of State may delegate the publication of quality standards. There is already a requirement to produce training. It seems to me that, and standards, it seems the Honourable Gentleman just wants to put the word quality in front of them. I'm pretty sure that the standards, I'm not sure there's any indication that the standards of training wouldn't be quality anyway. I'm not entirely sure. We really just need to add in that we just really want quality training. I'm sure that goes without saying that we want quality standards of training. I don't really think we need to put it on the face of the bill. Again, Amendment 80, Clause 5, insert trauma-informed care, including. And again, I think this should be done on I don't have a particular problem with that. Again, it's an issue of how prescriptive the training should be, and I've already spoken at length about that, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I think the Honourable Member makes some fair points in those particular amendments. And again, his other amendments, 83, 84, 85, I think particularly the one about the Secretary of State must make a statement to Parliament as soon as practicable following the publication of report under subsection 2. Difficult to disagree with that, to be perfectly honest. I don't really see why that wouldn't happen, and again, I'd be perfectly happy about that. And my honourable friend for Christchurch has made some amendments as well, where he wants to leave out mechanical or chemical and insert or mechanical. I think he wants to get rid of the chemical part of restraint from the bill. Now, a chemical restraint is one that can be referred to as a medical restraint to restrict the freedom of movement of a patient, and such chemical restraints can at times be used to sedate a patient as well if necessary. And so I think my honourable friend's amendment is understandable. My only concern is whether it might lead to perverse outcomes where in effect other chemical uses of force are used more often than they should be in order to sort of get round the terms of the bill. I'm just a bit nervous that may happen, and so I would deter my honourable friend from pressing ahead with that, even though I certainly understand where he's coming from. It seems that Amendment 90, Clause 1 and page 2, lines 14, that's just a consequential amendment to the amendment to reduce so I don't think we need to go and deal with that again. He wants to leave out paragraph B in Amendment 89 in Clause 1, page 2, line 5. This would remove the isolation of a patient from one of the things that would be referenced to while discussing the use of force. I am much more sympathetic to this one. I'm not entirely... I think my honourable friend makes a good point. I'm sure he'll express his own opinion when the time comes about why he feels so strongly about this. My view on the first reading of it was that it was a perfectly sensible amendment. Amendment 91, I think, is a consequential amendment to that. Amendment 98 is the one that he referred to earlier in my remarks, Madam Deputy Speaker, where he talked about inserting after patients and their families, to allow patients and their families to plan, develop and deliver their care and treatment in the mental health unit. And I think that this is an excellent amendment, to be perfectly honest, and I think it's essential that families are involved in the treatment of their family members. I think in many cases where there's been problems, if the family had been able to be more involved from the start, some of the problems wouldn't have happened. Some of the terrible situations that have happened absolutely would not have happened if families had been able to help and actually warn what the situation was with individual people. I think it's a very, very sensible amendment, and I hope he will pursue that with vigour, because I think it's really important that we involve family members in treatment. Amendment 100, where guidance is published no later than 6 months after the Act is passed, is particularly pertinent to the discussions that we've been having today. And again, my only quibble with his amendment is that maybe I think it's too long, 6 months, to be perfectly honest, but I certainly agree with the thrust of it, that there should be a time limit inserted, and so I would certainly... Yes, of course.
It all depends on when the draft guidance is produced. My amendment is referring to guidance, rather than, in other words, the guidance which emerges after any consultation. As I said earlier, I think the consultation should take place very early, but 6 months maximum.
Yes, well, I agree. I think my honourable friend is onto something with that, and I certainly agree with him. And really, it's probably quite extraordinary that we haven't got the draft guidance already. Really. But you know, we won't go around that particular issue again. Amendment 101 again is a very well. I think it's a sensible amendment. It's significant after any would therefore allow to be required keeping and recording of any significant use of force upon a patient by a member of staff. And again, I think that's sensible, because we don't want to be including other things that shouldn't be. I suppose the point I would make is that the word significant is a rather subjective term. One person's significant is maybe not another person's significant, and it might include something that's a bit difficult for trusts and staff to understand what counts as significant, and that's my only concern, whether it adds confusion to it. I'm sure my honourable friend will... Yes,
just briefly, I'm grateful for my honourable friend. Essentially, at the moment, clause 7.2 refers to leaving out cases where the use of force is negligible, and that's refined in subsection 3. Effectively, what I'm saying here is that significant is non-negligible.
Philip Davies.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention. I hope he'll expand a bit later about how you know. I think he's got a. I think he makes a good point, and I'm broadly sympathetic to it. So, Mr. Speaker, that I think it goes through the amendments on the order paper. Obviously, different members have tabled quite a few, and therefore that takes a bit of time. I would like to think that, like the honourable member for Croydon North, people have been convinced of the necessity for amendments 11 and 12, which go to the absolute heart of what this bill is supposed to be.
Can I just... I think some people, Mr Deputy Speaker, looking at today's proceedings may say my honourable friend has been speaking for a long time, but of course we need to remember that often when bills are considered, the amendments are grouped so that we don't consider all the amendments to the bill in one discussion. This morning we are putting the amendments to the whole of the bill in one group, and that's, I think, the explanation as to why my honourable friend has spoken for a bit longer than he might sometimes have done.
Well,
also, we don't need to be reminded how long he's done, because all we're doing is actually using up precious time. And I know you won't want to do that, Sir Christopher. Philip Davies. Let them...
Mr Deputy Speaker, and my honourable friend will have noticed that at no point did anybody in the chair say that I was off subject or...
Exactly, so we don't leave any...
or whatever. There were over 100 amendments to consider. Anyway, I would like the government to take responsibility today for amendments 11 and 12, which I think the honourable member, the proposer of the bill, wants to include in this thing. I hope that if we get the opportunity, Mr Deputy Speaker, to test the will of the House on those amendments, especially given as the honourable member opposite supports them, and we'll see what people make of them, because if we don't include amendments 11 and 12, we are doing a really big disservice to people who are trying to help today, and also I think we would be doing a disservice to the honour of Mr Lewis, that this bill from the honourable gentleman was all about, because those two amendments go to the heart of what he is trying to achieve in this bill, and I hope members will reflect on that before we vote on it.
Thank you very much indeed.